In 1974, in the middle of the night, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger received a phone call from the President of the United States. The voice on the line was trembling. He demanded that Kissinger come to the Oval Office immediately. When Kissinger arrived, he found the President on his knees on the floor, weeping. "They're going to get me, Kissinger," the man said. Then he asked that the two of them pray together. Kissinger, not a particularly religious man, knelt down beside him. The man weeping on the floor controlled the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Shortly afterward, military generals secretly issued an order. No unusual military command from the White House was to be carried out until they had been consulted first. This was President Richard Nixon, and he was not the most dangerous figure on today's list. Throughout American history, there have been people whom no one elected, whom no one was permitted to fire, who controlled weapons of mass destruction, ran covert foreign policy, and on one occasion nearly pulled the entire world into nuclear war, all while wearing uniforms or operating behind the scenes in the most distinguished buildings in Washington.
In 1974, while the entire world was fixated on the Watergate scandal splashed across morning newspapers, another secret was being kept deep within the most guarded rooms of the White House. A secret that, if exposed, might have made the wiretapping seem trivial, because something far more disturbing was unfolding inside the mind of the most powerful man on Earth. Richard Nixon was no longer himself. To understand how Nixon collapsed, you first have to understand where he came from. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in 1913 into a poor Quaker family in California. His home had no electricity, no running water. While other children played, Nixon studied relentlessly because it was the only path he knew out of poverty. He studied law, served in the military during World War II, and then entered politics with the mindset of someone who had spent his life fighting without pause. In 1968, after 8 bitter years of defeat, losing to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, and then losing the California governor's race in 1962, Nixon returned, won the presidency, and entered the White House. He called it the greatest comeback in American political history. And it truly was. The world saw Nixon as an unbreakable man. But behind that hardened exterior was someone deeply scarred. Nixon always felt like an outsider, unloved, underappreciated, and looked down upon by the wealthy elite and social aristocracy. That insecurity never left him, even as he sat in the most powerful office on Earth. It all began on a night in June 1972. At first glance, nothing remarkable. 5 burglars were arrested while breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate complex. Police arrived, handcuffed them, and the story could have ended there, just another minor burglary. But those 5 men were not ordinary criminals. They were connected to Nixon's Committee for the Re-election of the President. And when 2 young reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began pulling at the thread, the entire tangled web started to unravel. There were orders coming from inside the White House. There was hush money paid to silence witnesses, and, most importantly, there was Nixon, not the original mastermind, but the one who ordered the cover-up the moment the operation was exposed. That was his fatal mistake. It wasn't the Watergate break-in that destroyed Nixon, it was the cover-up. He lied, erased evidence, and used presidential power to obstruct the investigation. Over the next 2 years, the truth was peeled back layer by layer before the eyes of the American people and the world. But this is the part few people know about, the part even more terrifying than the wiretapping or the lies told to the public. In the final months of 1974, as the walls closed in, Richard Nixon began to collapse in the most literal sense. Those closest to him later recalled that he drank heavily, alone, in his office, night after night. He cried uncontrollably, he talked to himself. He wandered the halls of the White House at midnight, stopping in front of portraits of former presidents, bowing his head and whispering to them as if they were there, as if they could hear him. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and widely considered Nixon's closest confidant at the time, later recounted one particularly haunting night. Nixon called him at midnight, his voice trembling, and asked him to come to the Oval Office immediately. When Kissinger arrived, Nixon was on his knees, sobbing. He told Kissinger they needed to kneel together and pray. Kissinger, not a particularly religious man, knelt beside him, and the two most powerful men in America prayed together in the darkness of the White House. Kissinger later admitted he left the White House that night in a state of shock, not because the story sounded dramatic, but because he understood better than anyone the man crying on the floor, the man who had just spoken so irrationally, was in control of the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. And this was something that had never happened before in American history and has not happened since. James Schlesinger and George Brown began to grow seriously concerned about Nixon's mental state. This was not the kind of concern friends feel for a struggling loved one. This was the concern of men responsible for national security, because under the U.S. Constitution, the president alone has the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons, and no one has the legal right to veto that decision. Schlesinger quietly issued an unprecedented order. If the White House, anyone, including the president, contacted military commands with unusual instructions, especially involving nuclear forces, the commanders were to report back to him first. No orders were to be carried out without his approval. Put plainly, Schlesinger created a buffer between a president who was losing his grip and an arsenal capable of destroying human civilization. He did this alone, without authorization from Congress, without clear legal backing, and without informing Nixon. Technically, it was unconstitutional, an interference with the president's direct authority. But he did it because there was no other choice. For decades afterward, this story remained buried in classified files. Schlesinger never spoke of it publicly. Nixon never knew it had happened. Only when documents were gradually declassified and memoirs began to appear did the public learn that the United States and the world had once stood on such a razor's edge. On the night of August 8, 1974, Nixon appeared on national television for the last time as president. He announced his resignation. His voice was steadier than in the weeks before, perhaps because the decision had finally been made, the burden partially lifted. He did not apologize. He did not admit wrongdoing. He simply said he had lost the political support necessary to continue. The next morning, Nixon shook hands with White House staff, boarded Marine One, and as the helicopter lifted off from the South Lawn, he turned back for one last look through the window. Below him stood that white building, the place he had dreamed of entering since he was a poor boy in California, the place he had fought his entire life to reach, and the place he was now leaving in disgrace. A month later, Ford, his successor, granted Nixon a full pardon, meaning he would not stand trial for any crimes related to Watergate. Many Americans were outraged, but there was something they did not know at the time, that the most frightening part of this entire story was not the wiretapping, not the lies told to the public, but those nights when a man unraveling mentally sat alone with the power to end the world. Richard Nixon died in 1994 at the age of 81. Before his death, he had partially rehabilitated his public image through his role as an advisor on foreign policy, a field in which he truly excelled. He was the one who opened relations between the United States and China. He was the one who signed strategic arms agreements with the Soviet Union. History is not simple, and Nixon was not entirely a villain. But his story leaves behind a lesson that political scientists still debate today. Is the U.S. system of nuclear command and control, built on the assumption that the president is always rational and acting in the national interest, truly safe? The answer that the Nixon episode suggests, however uncomfortable, is not entirely. And that, more than any political scandal, may be the most chilling legacy Richard Nixon left to the world.
Number 2. Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. There are people who seem to be born for war, not in the romantic, cinematic sense of heroic figures, but in a cold, technical, emotionless way. Curtis Emerson LeMay was one of them. He did not hate the enemy. He did not relish violence. He simply viewed war as a problem to be solved, and he approached it by asking a single question: how can we destroy the most in the shortest time as completely as possible? The answers he found over the course of his military career killed hundreds of thousands of people, nearly sparked a global nuclear war, and left behind a question that military philosophers still struggle to answer. Where is the line between military genius and war crime?
Curtis LeMay was born in 1906 in Columbus, Ohio, into a family where poverty and instability were constant companions. His father frequently changed jobs, and the family moved constantly: Ohio, Montana, California, Pennsylvania, then back to Ohio. Before finishing high school, Curtis had transferred schools nearly a dozen times. A child growing up under such conditions typically learns one of two things: either to adapt and become resilient, or to become rigid and build an inner shell. LeMay chose both, but in his own way. He learned to do everything with his own hands: repairing cars, working metal, anything that required technical skill and precision. From a young age, he was fascinated by airplanes, back when aviation was still little more than a playground for wealthy thrill seekers. He taught himself to fly, sought out opportunities, and by 1928 had joined the U.S. Army Air Corps. What set LeMay apart was not just that he was an excellent pilot, though he was. What made him different was that he saw what others did not. While most pilots of his time thought about flying, LeMay thought in systems. He asked, how can multiple aircraft operate together most efficiently? How can a target be attacked with the fewest losses to defenses and enemy fighters? His mind worked like that of an engineer analyzing a production process, except his production was destruction. By World War II, LeMay had become one of the most respected and feared air commanders in the U.S. military. He led bombing campaigns in Europe, where he developed formation tactics that helped protect aircraft from ground fire and enemy fighters. He became so well known that his men nicknamed him Iron Ass Curtis, a name that carried both respect and unease. But the darkest and most controversial chapter of LeMay's life came on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, when he was commanding bombing operations against Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands. Up to that point, the U.S. bombing strategy over Japan had been largely ineffective. High-altitude, daytime raids targeting industrial facilities caused limited damage. Cloud cover, high winds, and the limitations of bombing technology made accuracy poor. Japan continued producing weapons, continued fighting, and its will remained unbroken. LeMay decided to change everything. Instead of high-altitude daytime bombing, he ordered low-altitude nighttime attacks, flying at around 2,000 meters. Instead of conventional bombs, he used napalm. Napalm did not destroy steel factories or concrete bunkers. It burned everything that could burn. And Tokyo, with its tightly packed wooden houses, was essentially a vast field of kindling waiting for a spark. That night, 334 B-29 bombers took off. Within hours, they dropped more than 1,500 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. The fires spread so rapidly that they created a firestorm. Hot air rising pulled in cooler air from surrounding areas, generating a massive, swirling inferno. People who fled to the rivers to escape the flames died as the water itself began to boil. Those who hid in shelters suffocated as the fires consumed the oxygen. By the next morning, more than 267 square kilometers of the city had been reduced to ash. The death toll from that single night is estimated between 80,000 and 100,000. It remains the deadliest night of bombing in history, even more lethal than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that followed. If we had lost this war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Luckily, we won. Curtis LeMay speaking to General Robert McNamara after the war. This is one of the most candid admissions in military history. LeMay felt no regret. Until the end of his life, he believed that those bombing campaigns ended the war sooner and saved more American lives than the Japanese lives they took. That may be a rational argument from a purely strategic standpoint, but it's also the argument of someone accustomed to viewing tens of thousands of deaths as numbers on a spreadsheet. After World War II, the world entered the Cold War, a silent but dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in that context, Curtis LeMay was given a role that few people could sleep soundly knowing he held. In 1948, LeMay was appointed commander of the Strategic Air Command. This was the unit that controlled America's entire nuclear bomber force. When LeMay took over, SAC was disorganized and ineffective. By the time he left in 1957, it had become the most efficient and terrifying war machine in human history, with thousands of nuclear warheads ready to launch at any moment. LeMay built SAC on a simple philosophy: always be ready to fight anytime, anywhere. He kept 1/3 of the bomber force on alert, ready to take off within 15 minutes. He maintained continuous airborne patrols carrying nuclear bombs, flying along the borders of the Soviet Union. If an attack order came, those aircraft could reach their targets before the Soviets had time to react. But here is the part that kept strategic analysts awake at night. LeMay did not just want to be ready for defense. He firmly believed in preemptive strike. His philosophy was this: if nuclear war was inevitable, and he believed it was, then it was better to strike first, before the Soviet Union became strong enough to retaliate. He seriously proposed to his superiors that SAC should attack the Soviet Union immediately, before they had sufficient weapons to respond. The proposal was rejected, but the fact that a senior commander made it in earnest reveals a great deal about his mindset. Then came October 1962, and LeMay nearly dragged the entire world into nuclear war. It began when a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed missile launch sites under construction in Cuba, less than 150 kilometers from the coast of Florida. These were Soviet missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads and reaching most major American cities. President Kennedy was informed early on the morning of October 16th. Thus began the most tense 13 days in human history. Kennedy convened a group of advisors known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to decide how to respond. In that room were cabinet members, diplomats, intelligence analysts, and Curtis LeMay, then serving as Air Force Chief of Staff. From the very beginning, LeMay's position was clear-cut: strike immediately, no negotiations. He wanted to launch airstrikes against Cuba within 24 hours, destroying all missile sites before they became operational. His plan required 500 to 2,000 combat sorties, and he was fully confident the Soviet Union would dare not respond. Kennedy asked directly, "If we attack Cuba, what will the Soviets do?" LeMay answered without hesitation, "Nothing. They would understand this was America's backyard, and they had no right to interfere." Kennedy looked at him, paused, and asked again, "What if they retaliate in Berlin?" LeMay replied, "They won't."
Kennedy did not believe him, and he was right. Throughout those 13 days, the tension inside the ExComm meeting room was no less intense than outside, and the person creating the most tension was not the Soviets, but Curtis LeMay. Secret recordings that Kennedy had installed in the meeting room, declassified decades later, captured heated arguments. LeMay did not just disagree with Kennedy, he openly showed contempt for his president. When Kennedy chose a naval blockade instead of immediate military attack, LeMay turned to his colleagues and said loudly enough for Kennedy to hear, "This is almost as bad as the Munich appeasement." He was comparing Kennedy to Neville Chamberlain, the man who had conceded to Hitler before World War II, an insult of the highest order coming from an American general at the time. Kennedy left the room after that meeting, and his closest aide later recalled that the president was furious, not out of fear, but because he knew LeMay was dangerously wrong. Kennedy had studied enough history to understand that in every military crisis, the first escalation often leads to further escalations that no one can control. Limited war, controlled response. He believed in that. LeMay did not. To him, half measures were worse than doing nothing. Either strike until the enemy can no longer respond, or do not strike at all. What LeMay did not know, and had he known it might have changed his judgment, was what was happening beneath the Atlantic Ocean during those same days. The U.S. Navy was pursuing and dropping depth charges near Soviet submarines around the quarantine zone. What no one in ExComm knew was that those submarines carried nuclear torpedoes, and their crews had the authority to use them if attacked and cut off from Moscow. One of those submarines, B-59, was harassed with depth charges to the point that its captain, Vasily Arkhipov, came close to authorizing the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Only because a senior officer aboard objected was the weapon not fired. If that torpedo had been launched, the chain reaction would have been unstoppable, and LeMay, the man who wanted escalation from day one, would have gotten his nuclear war. On October 27, 1962, the Soviet submarine B-59 was subjected to continuous depth charge explosions and lost contact with Moscow. Captain Valentin Savitsky ordered preparations to launch a nuclear torpedo. Only the opposition of a single officer, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented it from happening. Arkhipov would later be called by historians the man who saved the world. When Nikita Khrushchev finally agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey, John F. Kennedy breathed a sigh of relief. Most members of the ex-com breathed a sigh of relief. The entire world breathed a sigh of relief, even though it had no idea how close it had come to catastrophe. Curtis LeMay did not breathe a sigh of relief. He was furious. In his view, this was a complete failure. The United States had allowed the Soviet Union to withdraw with its honor intact, and that would only encourage further challenges. He called the outcome the greatest defeat in American history and continued to advocate for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. For the rest of his life, he never admitted that his preferred course of action might have ended in nuclear war. The relationship between LeMay and Kennedy became completely cold from that point on. Kennedy knew that within his military was a man of immense power who believed in a strategy the president considered reckless. In January 1963, LeMay's term as chief of staff was extended for one more year, not because Kennedy trusted him, but because dismissing him at that moment would have created too much political turmoil. They needed each other in form, but neither had any illusions left about mutual trust. In November 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. LeMay was on a hunting trip at the time and had to cut it short to return to Washington. Those present later recalled that he did not appear especially grief-stricken. He simply took on his duties, did what was needed to be done, and continued his career. LeMay retired in 1965 with full honors and decorations. In 1968, he reappeared in politics when independent presidential candidate Joe Wallace chose him as his running mate. During the campaign, LeMay stated that he did not necessarily oppose the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam if deemed necessary, a remark that alarmed even Wallace, who had to stand beside him before the press to clarify his statement. He died in 1990 at the age of 83. Until the end of his life, he believed he had been right. About Tokyo, about Cuba, about Vietnam. He was a man incapable of doubting himself strategically, a trait that made him both a terrifyingly effective commander and a danger to anyone who placed life-and-death decisions in his hands. The legacy of Curtis LeMay is complex in a deeply unsettling way. He was not a villain from a film, no maniacal laughter, no overtly malicious intent. He was someone who genuinely believed he was defending his country. He simply lacked the ability to imagine that he could be wrong, that power is not always the right answer, and that escalation does not always end as planned. The question history poses about Curtis LeMay is not whether he was good or evil. The question is, what system, what structure of power allowed a man with such a mindset to sit in a position controlling thousands of nuclear warheads for nearly a decade? And does that system ensure that this will not happen again?
Number 3. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces.
In American military history, no figure was both as great and as dangerous at the same time as Douglas MacArthur. He was an undeniable tactical genius. His Incheon landing in 1950 is still taught in military academies today as a classic example of boldness and brilliance. Yet he was also the man who, on his own initiative and without authorization, repeatedly pushed the United States to the brink of a full-scale nuclear war with China and the Soviet Union, and never once felt he had done anything wrong. To understand MacArthur, one must begin with a fundamental truth. He never truly believed he had to obey anyone. Not because he was rebellious or undisciplined in any ordinary sense, but because in his own mind he stood on a higher plane than everyone around him, including the President of the United States. Douglas MacArthur was born in 1880 into a family where the military was not just a profession, it was a religion. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a Civil War hero who later became a major general and served as military governor of the Philippines. From a young age, Douglas grew up on military bases, listening to stories of battle and breathing in the air of glory and discipline. In 1903, he graduated at the top of his class from United States Military Academy with the highest scores in 25 years, not first by a narrow margin, but by a staggering distance. This reinforced in him an unshakable belief that he was superior to those around him, and therefore his judgment was more reliable than theirs.
During World War I, he fought with such courage that he was nominated for the Medal of Honor, though he ultimately did not receive it. In World War II, he commanded the Pacific Campaign with a series of brilliant decisions, most notably the island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified islands instead of attacking each one directly, saving tens of thousands of American lives. On September 2, 1945, it was he who represented the Allied forces in accepting Japan's surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri, BB-63, a moment where he stood on the deck in an open-collar uniform, Ray-Ban sunglasses on, a corncob pipe in his mouth, looking like the author of his own script. After the war, MacArthur remained in Japan as supreme commander of the Allied powers, and for 5 years he ruled Japan almost like an emperor. He signed decrees, introduced a new constitution, and reformed Japanese society from top to bottom. Japanese citizens bowed to him in the streets. Officials waited for hours just to meet him for 5 minutes. In his Tokyo office, MacArthur lived in a bubble of absolute power. No one opposed him. No one dared tell him he was wrong. That was precisely the problem. When a man grows accustomed to never being challenged for years, he loses the ability to accept opposition. And when that man commands a massive military force in a real war, it becomes a serious danger. In June 1950, North Korean forces, armed by the Soviet Union and backed by China, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. Within weeks, they pushed South Korean and American forces into a small corner at the southern tip of the peninsula, known as the Pusan Perimeter. The situation was extremely dire. MacArthur, then 70 years old, was placed in command of United Nations forces in Korea, and he acted immediately with a move that stunned the world. On September 15, 1950, he launched the Incheon Landing, one of the boldest operations in modern warfare. Nearly every military expert opposed it. Incheon had extreme tides, narrow channels, high seawalls, and North Korean forces could easily defend it. Chiefs of staff from Washington flew to Tokyo to persuade MacArthur to abandon the plan. MacArthur listened, then essentially replied, "Precisely because all of you think it cannot be done, the enemy will not expect us to attempt it. That is why we will do it." He was right. The Incheon operation succeeded beyond all expectations. North Korean forces were cut off from their supply lines, collapsed, and retreated northward. Within weeks, United Nations forces not only repelled the invasion, but pushed deep into the north, recapturing Seoul and continuing their advance toward the 38th parallel. This was the moment when victory began to intoxicate Douglas MacArthur, and when the real trouble began. The question in September 1950 was this: after pushing North Korean forces back above the 38th parallel, should they stop? The original mission of the United Nations was to restore the pre-war status quo, meaning halt at the 38th parallel. But MacArthur had a different vision. He wanted to unify the entire Korean peninsula under a pro-American South Korean government and completely destroy the North Korean army. President Harry Truman and his advisors feared this would draw China into the war. China had repeatedly warned through diplomatic channels that it would not allow hostile forces to approach its border. MacArthur brushed off those warnings. In his view, China was bluffing and would not dare to act. Truman, despite his concerns, ultimately authorized the advance north, with the condition that Chinese territory must not be attacked and that forces must stop short of the Sino-Korean border. MacArthur agreed and immediately began to sidestep those conditions in various ways. He sent South Korean and American units straight toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. He ordered airstrikes on bridges spanning the Yalu, coming dangerously close to Chinese territory. When Washington intervened and demanded restraint, he complained and sought ways around the orders. He consistently underestimated China's willingness to respond, even telling Truman during their meeting at Wake Island in October 1950 that China would definitely not enter the war, and that even if it did, it would be easily crushed. Then, in November 1950, more than 300,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu under the cover of darkness. As Chinese forces surged in and drove United Nations troops southward in a humiliating and bloody retreat, MacArthur was confronted with a harsh reality. He had been wrong. He had been overconfident, underestimated the enemy, and led his forces into a massive trap. Tens of thousands of American and Allied soldiers were dying in the freezing Korean winter. For most generals, such a failure would have prompted a reassessment of strategy.
Perhaps a withdrawal, a stabilization of defensive lines, or a search for a political solution. MacArthur did not do that. He escalated. He submitted to Washington a plan so extreme that even the hard-line generals were alarmed. He proposed using 26 atomic bombs, not to strike cities or industrial centers like in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but to create a radioactive belt along North Korea's northern border, stretching from the east coast to the west coast, completely cutting off all supply routes from China and the Soviet Union. The idea, technically, was this. Nuclear detonations would create a zone of intense radiation in a narrow strip along the border. No army could cross it without suffering lethal doses of radiation. In theory, it would seal off the Korean peninsula, allowing United Nations forces to defeat North Korean and Chinese troops on their side without fear of reinforcements. It may sound like pure tactical logic, but let's pause here and consider what that plan truly meant. 26 atomic bombs scattered along 200 kilometers of the Korean border would create a radioactive contamination zone lasting for decades. Wind and rain would carry the fallout deep into Chinese and Soviet territory. Millions of Korean, Chinese, and Soviet civilians would be exposed. And more consequentially than anything else, this would be the first time in history that nuclear weapons were used in a conventional war involving other nuclear powers. The Soviet Union already had the atomic bomb by then. If the United States used nuclear weapons in Korea, even just to create a barrier, what would the Soviet response be? Would they stand back and assess the situation, or would this be the spark that ignited the powderkin the entire world had been trying not to touch? Beyond the radioactive barrier plan, MacArthur proposed several other ideas no less audacious. He wanted to bomb Manchuria, China's vital industrial region in the north. He wanted to impose a total naval blockade of the Chinese coastline. He wanted to land Chiang Kai-shek's forces from Taiwan onto the Chinese mainland to open a second front. Each of those proposals, if carried out, would almost certainly have led to all-out war with China, and very likely drawn in the Soviet Union under the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Dalian Alliance signed just months earlier in 1950. Washington refused everything. Truman, Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were in agreement. This was the wrong war at the wrong time against the wrong enemy. America could not allow a localized conflict in Korea to escalate to World War III. MacArthur disagreed, and he had no hesitation saying that to anyone who would listen. If MacArthur had simply proposed bold plans and accepted their rejection, he might have remained a controversial general but not a genuine danger. But he did not stop there. When Washington refused his plans, he began acting on his own in ways that directly violated every principle of civil-military democracy.
In March of 1951, Truman was preparing to send a peace negotiation proposal to China and North Korea, a delicate diplomatic move that needed to be kept quiet until the moment was right. MacArthur knew this, and he did what no American general had dared to do before or since. He sent his own ultimatum to the Chinese military commander, threatening that if China refused to negotiate on American terms, he would expand the war onto the Chinese mainland. That ultimatum, dispatched without the authorization of the President or the State Department, completely torpedoed Truman's peace initiative. Beijing received the message, and the message was unmistakable. Even if Washington wanted to negotiate, the general in the field was threatening the opposite. No nation could negotiate in good faith under those circumstances. Truman was furious, but still held back, calculating that dismissing MacArthur at that moment would trigger too much political trouble at home. But MacArthur was not finished. Weeks later, he sent a letter to Joseph Martin, the Republican House Minority Leader and one of Truman's fiercest political opponents. In that letter, MacArthur did not merely criticize the president's policy. He argued that the United States needed to commit fully to the war in Asia, that this was the decisive front of the Cold War, and that those restraining him were committing a historic mistake. Martin read the letter out loud before the House of Representatives, before all of Congress and the world's press. This was no longer an internal disagreement. This was an active-duty general publicly campaigning against presidential policy, aligning himself with the political opposition, and challenging civilian authority in a manner that, in many other countries, would have been called the prelude to a coup.
The American Constitution is explicit. The President is the supreme commander of the armed forces. The military answers to civilian authority, not the other way around. Since the time of George Washington, this principle had been considered sacred. MacArthur did not merely violate that principle, he did so openly, repeatedly, and without a moment's apparent remorse. On the night of April 9, 1951, President Harry Truman sat alone in his office and made the decision he knew would unleash the greatest political storm of his presidency. He signed the order relieving Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. Not because MacArthur had lost battles, though he had misjudged China catastrophically. Not because he was old or no longer capable, he was still commanding a functioning fighting force. Truman fired MacArthur for a reason that was simple and foundational. A general cannot unilaterally determine the national policy of his own country. In a democracy, the military answers to civilian authority, and MacArthur had violated that principle not once, but many times, deliberately and without apology. The news was announced at 1 in the morning on April 11th, earlier than planned because the press had already caught wind of it. The American reaction was seismic. Truman was excoriated in the press. The Senate opened hearings. The city of Chicago burned him in effigy. Members of Congress called for the president's impeachment. Letters and telegrams flooded the White House at a ratio of 20-1 in favor of MacArthur. MacArthur returned home to a triumphal reception. Millions poured into the streets of New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. He delivered his famous address before Congress, closing with the words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." The entire chamber rose to its feet in tearful applause. Truman watched that address on television and said to his aide, in the blunt manner that was always his, "That was a complete bullshit performance. I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the President of the United States. I couldn't let that continue." President Harry Truman explaining his decision to relieve MacArthur. It is considered one of the most courageous acts in the history of American civil-military relations. If MacArthur had been allowed to have his way, what would have happened? This is the question historians have debated for decades, and the answers, while not entirely certain, all point in the same alarming direction. If MacArthur had been permitted to bomb Manchuria, China would have escalated. They already had 300,000 troops in Korea. After an attack on the mainland, they would have sent more. And this time the Soviet Union, bound to China by the treaty signed in 1950, would have had legal justification to intervene directly. The Soviet Union possessed the atomic bomb since 1949. If MacArthur had carried out the radioactive barrier plan, the fallout from 26 nuclear detonations in a narrow strip would not have stayed put. The Northeast Asian winter monsoon would have carried it deep into Chinese and Soviet territory. This would have constituted a direct act of nuclear war against both of the major powers to the east. What would their response have been when confronted with a nuclear attack, regardless of whether MacArthur chose to call it that? If Taiwan's forces had landed on the mainland, this was the scenario Mao Zedong regarded as an absolute existential threat. The People's Republic of China had only been established in 1949. Attacked from two directions simultaneously, Mao would have had no choice but to fight to the last with everything at his disposal. And everything at that point included Soviet forces stationed near the border. Scholars such as Bruce Cummings, author of the most comprehensive history of the Korean War ever written, conclude that the scenario in which MacArthur was free to act almost certainly would have led to a third world war with nuclear weapons deployed by multiple parties. The death toll could not be measured against the numbers of the Korean War or even the Second World War. Douglas MacArthur lived 13 more years after his dismissal, dying in 1964 at the age of 84. He never received the political vindication he had hoped for. The effort to secure him the Republican presidential nomination in 1952 collapsed entirely when Eisenhower, once MacArthur's subordinate, won the nomination and went on to become president. He spent his final years at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, writing his memoirs and occasionally accepting speaking invitations. In 1962, he was invited to West Point for the last time to address incoming cadets, and that speech on honor, duty, and country is considered one of the finest addresses in American military history. Therein lies the MacArthur paradox. He could speak beautifully and truly about honor and duty, while being the same man who had repeatedly placed his own ego and personal judgment above the duty of submitting to legitimate authority. He could be a great general and a danger to democracy, not in turn, but simultaneously. Truman, vilified when he fired MacArthur, vindicated by history, summed up the lesson of the entire episode in a remark he made privately to an aide years later. Military greatness gives no one the right to decide the fate of a people. That belongs to the people and those the people elect. Anyone who forgets that, however gifted they may be, is a threat to the Republic. In 1962, in one of his rare moments of acknowledged complexity, MacArthur told President Kennedy, who had come to ask his advice on Vietnam, that the United States should not send combat troops onto the Asian mainland. He said that Asia was too vast, too populous, and any ground war there would drain America to exhaustion. Kennedy later recalled that it was the best counsel he received on Southeast Asia. The irony is sharp. The man who had once wanted to expand the war under the Chinese mainland was the only one with enough experience to understand the madness of it. Sometimes wisdom only arrives after you were already the one who was out of his mind.
Number 4. Stanley McChrystal, NATO commander in Afghanistan.
If you were given the task of writing the script for a brilliant general destroying his own career in the most foolish way imaginable, you probably wouldn't dare write what actually happened to Stanley McChrystal because it sounds too absurd. One of the most outstanding generals of his generation, a man who had spent his entire life forging iron discipline in special operations forces at the most dangerous places on Earth, allowed himself and his entire staff to freely badmouth the president, the vice president, and a string of senior officials directly in front of a magazine journalist for weeks on end. That magazine was Rolling Stone, that journalist was Michael Hastings, and the article, published in June of 2010, ended McChrystal's military career within 72 hours. But to understand why it happened and why it matters beyond a simple scandal, we need to go back much further to a man shaped by things few people could survive intact. Stanley Allen McChrystal was born in 1954 into a thoroughbred military family. His father was an Army Major General. His brothers also served. For many people, growing up in that environment might become a burden, the pressure to be worthy of a legacy, to prove oneself. For McChrystal, it became fuel. He entered West Point in 1972, graduated in 1976, and from his earliest days in uniform stood out for a rare combination: exceptional tactical intelligence paired with physical and mental endurance far beyond the average. He ate one meal a day for years. He slept 4 hours a night and maintained that habit throughout his career. He ran marathons while commanding classified special operations. Soldiers under his command recalled that during certain periods, he seemed not to need sleep or food. He simply worked, analyzed, decided, then worked again. Most of McChrystal's career unfolded in darkness, in the most literal sense. He spent years working with the Joint Special Operations Task Force, then the Joint Special Operations Command, known as JSOC. This was the most secretive unit in the American military. Their operations went unacknowledged, their dead sometimes went unrecognized publicly, and the entire operational structure was designed to avoid any outside scrutiny. In that environment, McChrystal developed into a genuine genius of modern covert warfare. He rebuilt the entire way JSOC functioned from a rigid hierarchical model to a flexible network where information flowed laterally rather than only top-down. He believed that in modern asymmetric warfare, the speed of decision-making mattered more than perfection in planning. He trained special operations soldiers not merely to fight, but to think. His most celebrated achievement during this period was the hunt for and killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, a man considered more immediately dangerous than Osama bin Laden in the sheer directness of his brutality. That operation spanned years and demanded a level of patience and intelligence analysis that had never previously been applied so systematically within the American military. When al-Zarqawi was killed in 2006, McChrystal received commendation from virtually all of the senior American military and intelligence leadership.
In June of 2009, President Barack Obama appointed McChrystal as commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, known as ISAF. It was the highest command position in the Afghan war and simultaneously the most difficult assignment any American general could receive at that moment. Afghanistan in 2009 was a grim picture. After 8 years of war, the Taliban had not been defeated. They were actively recovering. The Karzai government in Kabul was so corrupt that ordinary Afghans trusted Taliban courts more than state courts. The southern and eastern provinces were effectively outside government control, and NATO forces drawn from dozens of nations with different doctrines, languages, and priorities functioned like a many-headed machine with no shared brain. McChrystal was handed the mission to stabilize Afghanistan, build Afghan security forces strong enough to stand on their own, and create the conditions for an honorable American withdrawal. Obama wanted results, wanted a clear strategy, and wanted it quickly because the Afghan war had consumed incalculable amounts of money and blood with nothing to show the American public. McChrystal took the assignment and immediately did what he did best. He assessed the situation with a frankness that bordered on brutal. After several months of evaluation, he sent the Pentagon a 66-page report, a document that was later leaked to the press and sent shockwaves through Washington. The report said it plainly. The situation was worse than anyone was publicly acknowledging. The strategy was not working. Without fundamental change in both strategy and resources, the mission would fail. And to turn things around, McChrystal needed 40,000 additional troops. This was the moment things began to grow complicated, and the moment McChrystal's character began colliding with political reality in ways he was clearly not prepared to navigate. Obama was not easily persuaded. He was the president who had campaigned on a promise to end the Bush-era wars, and escalating in Afghanistan, pouring in another 40,000 troops, was something that would trigger fierce backlash in the Democratic Party and among the public. He wanted time to examine all options carefully before deciding. McChrystal understood this in his own particular way, and how he understood it led to the first in the chain of mistakes that would lead to his downfall.
In October of 2009, while Obama was still in the midst of his internal review, McChrystal flew to London to speak at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS. In an open presentation before the public and the press, he was asked about the alternative proposal put forward by Vice President Biden. Rather than a large-scale troop surge, using small special operations units and drones to strike al-Qaeda. McChrystal replied bluntly, that approach was under-resourced and under-visioned and would lead to chaos and chaos. In an internal meeting, that would have been an entirely normal and even necessary opinion, but McChrystal said it in public, in front of the press, while the president was still deliberating. This was lobbying through the media, a way of applying public pressure on the president's decision by pushing the debate out from behind closed doors. Obama was angry and had every right to be. He summoned McChrystal back to Washington for a direct meeting, and that meeting was described as tense. Obama ultimately approved the troop increase, not 40,000 but 30,000, along with a clear withdrawal timeline beginning in 2011. McChrystal got essentially what he wanted, but the relationship between him and the White House had been damaged, and that would prove more consequential than he realized in the months ahead. Michael Hastings was a freelance war correspondent who had reported from Iraq and had a reputation for being unafraid of confrontation. He approached McChrystal's team requesting to embed with them and write a long profile of the commander and the Afghan strategy for Rolling Stone. McChrystal's team agreed, a decision that many of them would certainly wish they could take back. What happened next was likely the product of several factors combining at once. Part of it was arrogance. McChrystal and his team were accustomed to a particular kind of journalism, the kind that embeds with military units and tends to write sympathetic, respectful pieces about the armed forces. They were not accustomed to independent investigative reporters. Part of it was the environment. Weeks spent together in Paris, Brussels, and Kabul, long flights, end-of-day drinks, all of which created a false sense of intimacy. And part of it, perhaps, was exhaustion. People who have been under extreme pressure for too long sometimes forget that someone is recording everything they say. Hastings recorded everything. All of it. The article was titled The Runaway General, and when it was published on June 22, 2010, it did not merely shake Washington, it shook people within the military who thought they knew who McChrystal was. What McChrystal and his team said in front of the reporter. The following remarks were recorded directly by journalist Michael Hastings over several weeks spent with McChrystal's team. All were published verbatim. Reading those remarks, one might think, they're not actually that damning. No military secrets were revealed, no war plans were compromised, just disrespectful comments, the kind people make in kitchens, in locker rooms, anywhere they think there's no microphone running. But that was precisely the problem. There was a microphone running, and McChrystal knew it. When the Rolling Stone article was published, the White House response was not impulsive anger, it was the cold, calculated kind of fury, which is far more dangerous. Obama read the article on Air Force One. Those present described him as not visibly enraged, he simply went quiet. When the plane landed, he told White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel in a few words, "Get McChrystal back here." Not ask for an explanation, not look into this further, just get him back here. McChrystal flew from Kabul to Washington. On that flight, he prepared his letter of resignation. He knew, or at least sensed, that the meeting the next day could end no other way. He had been the one to make hard decisions in situations with no exit. He understood the logic of moments like this. The meeting between Obama and McChrystal in the Oval Office on June 23, 2010, lasted approximately 30 minutes. No one in that room has ever disclosed what specifically was said. Both sides maintained silence about the substance. What the public knows is that McChrystal walked out after 30 minutes, and his 34-year military career ended there. Obama made his statement to the press that afternoon. He did not say McChrystal was a bad person or an incompetent general. He said the opposite, that McChrystal had served the country with distinction, that his record deserved respect. But he also said one sentence that everyone in military and political circles understood the true meaning of. The conduct represented in the Rolling Stone article does not meet the standard that should be set by a commanding general.
What followed was the announcement everyone already knew was coming. I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the President of the United States. I couldn't let that continue. President Harry Truman on MacArthur. But the words apply with equal force here. Obama spoke of standards, of what he expected from leaders serving under him. Under me. Two words that said everything. This was not personal. This was about principle. The same principle Truman had defended when he fired MacArthur. The principle on which the American Republic was built. The military answers to civilian authority. Was McChrystal actually out of his mind, or had he simply stopped recognizing the boundary? This is the most complex part of the story, and the part that makes McChrystal different from Nixon and MacArthur in an important way. Nixon unraveled through alcohol and depression in the context of Watergate. MacArthur was dangerous because he genuinely believed he knew better than the president and was prepared to act unilaterally to prove it. McChrystal, he was not deranged, did not lose control entirely, and had no intention of triggering a nuclear crisis. So does he actually belong on this list? The answer lies not in any single action, but in what it revealed about a systemic problem far more dangerous than any individual incident. What the Rolling Stone article exposed was not a man who became careless on one particular afternoon. It exposed the entire senior American military leadership in Afghanistan, the commanding general and those around him, operating from a place of deep contempt for virtually the entire civilian chain of command above them. The president was considered not ready, the vice president was considered not worth taking seriously, the national security advisor was considered a dinosaur, the special envoy was considered someone who made people sick. These were not the words of tired men joking with each other after a long day. These were the foundational attitudes, the worldview, of a group leading the longest war in American history. And that attitude, that the people making strategic decisions in Washington conference rooms understood nothing, deserved no respect, and should have no decisive voice in military strategy, is the attitude that has always underlain every civil-military danger in history.
McChrystal did not propose dropping atomic bombs or neutralizing the president, but he was commanding a war involving 150,000 troops while privately regarding the people giving him orders as incompetent. Under those conditions, when real strategic disagreements arose, when pressure from the battlefield mounted, when life and death decisions had to be made in minutes, would he have obeyed orders he disagreed with? History has no answer, because Obama did not allow that situation to develop. What makes McChrystal different from most of the figures on this list, and what gives his story a different dimension, is what happened after he left the military. He did not leave in anger. He did not go on television to criticize Obama. He did not write a memoir blaming everyone else. Instead, he stepped back, rethought, and after a period of time began teaching and writing about leadership and organizations. His most celebrated book, Team of Teams, published in 2015, is a genuinely outstanding work on how to build adaptive organizations in complex environments. In it, he discusses lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, but not in the self-justifying manner one might expect. He's candid about what went wrong, about what he and people like him failed to understand, about the limits of military thinking in an increasingly non-linear world. In one interview years after the Rolling Stone incident, he acknowledged something openly that few generals have the courage to say. "I let my environment control me instead of controlling my environment. That was a leadership failure, not Rolling Stone's, not Obama's, mine." That is a rare kind of honesty, and it raises the question, if McChrystal possessed that capacity for self-awareness, why didn't he have it in 2010? The answer is perhaps this: because years in the JSOC environment, years of absolute authority in Afghanistan, had created a bubble in which he had never been required to exercise the most important muscle in any leader's body, the ability to see oneself from the outside. Obama appointed General David Petraeus to replace McChrystal in Afghanistan. He was the obvious choice and came with enormous expectations. He had accomplished in Iraq what many considered impossible, stabilizing the situation through a combination of military force and tribal diplomacy, reducing violence to manageable levels. But Afghanistan was not Iraq. Different terrain, different history, different tribal structures, and a different degree of corruption in the host government. Obama's troop surge, which both McChrystal and Petraeus had advocated, produced mixed results. Some provinces were stabilized in the short term, but when American forces began to withdraw, the Taliban filled the vacuum. In 2021, after 20 years of war, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan in chaos, and the Taliban took over the entire country within 11 days. No major battle. The Afghan military that America had spent 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building dissolved with almost no resistance. The question that raises for McChrystal's story is cruel in a particular way. Could any strategy, including what McChrystal proposed, have produced a different outcome? Or was the entire war, from beginning to end, an impossible mission handed in succession to America's most talented generals and completed by none of them? If the answer is no strategy would have worked, then McChrystal's fall is not the story of an arrogant man. It is the story of an intelligent man placed in a situation with no exit, inside a system incapable of acknowledging that some missions are impossible from the very beginning. What does McChrystal teach us that Nixon and MacArthur did not? If Nixon showed the danger of nuclear authority in the hands of a man losing his mind, and MacArthur showed the danger of a general who believes himself superior to civilian power, then McChrystal shows something more subtle and perhaps more common in modern military and non-military organizations alike. He shows what happens when a person trained in an environment of absolute control, where every decision rests with him, where no one contradicts him because no one can, is then placed into a system where power is shared, monitored, and challenged through democratic mechanisms. That person does not know how to function in that system, not because he's bad, but because he was never taught. And that is the most important lesson, not only for the military, but for any organization. Talent and sound judgment in one environment do not automatically transfer to sound judgment in another.
The best people in the darkness of special operations warfare, where no explanation is needed, no consensus required, no transparency demanded, can be the most dangerous people when placed in the light of public accountability. McChrystal understands that now, but he understood it only after paying with 34 years of career. The question is not whether people like McChrystal exist in the military. They certainly do, and will continue to. The question is whether the civil military oversight system is strong enough to detect and stop the problem before it escalates beyond control. In McChrystal's case, the answer was yes, but only barely, and only thanks to a rock magazine journalist with a notebook and a pen. Rolling Stone is not always there when you need it.
Number 5. Oliver North, Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps.
There is a question rarely asked about Iran-Contra, not what happened or who was responsible, but a more fundamental and far more unsettling question. How could a lieutenant colonel, not a general, not a cabinet secretary, not a president, single-handedly run a secret parallel foreign policy for years involving at least 3 countries, tens of millions of dollars, illegal arms transactions, and a network of intermediaries stretching from Tehran to Managua without anyone in Washington knowing, or if they knew, pretending they didn't? The answer to that question is not simple. It requires understanding Oliver North not as a villain in a spy film, but as a real, complex human being shaped by very specific things and dangerous for precisely that reason. Oliver Lawrence North was born in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, into an ordinary military family. Nothing in his childhood hinted at anything unusual, except one trait that everyone who knew him from an early age mentioned. He could not tolerate failure. Not in the way of ordinary ambition, but almost physiologically, as though his brain had not been programmed to accept imperfect outcomes. He entered the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1963, graduated in 1968, and joined the Marine Corps just as the Vietnam War was entering its bloodiest phase. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, fighting with such courage that he was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V for valor, and 2 Purple Hearts, the honored wounds of the battlefield. He did not merely fight well. He fought in a way his soldiers never forgot, the way of a commander who does not sit behind the lines to direct, but stands at the front to lead. After Vietnam, he continued rising through the Marine Corps, attending senior staff and leadership training courses. And in 1981, when Ronald Reagan entered the White House determined to reverse what he called America's decline during the 1970s, Oliver North, then just 37 years old, holding the rank of major, was assigned to the National Security Council, known as the NSC. The NSC is the body that advises the president directly on national security policy, not an intelligence agency, not the military, but a coordinating group bridging the president and all the other agencies. In its original design, the NSC had no operational function. They advised, they did not execute. Oliver North would change that. To understand Iran-Contra, one must understand 2 parallel crises unfolding simultaneously in the early 1980s, and the way they intersected inside Oliver North's mind in a manner he believed was genius, but which was in fact a catastrophe. The first crisis was in Iran. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic of Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini. American-Iranian relations, already damaged by the 1979 embassy hostage crisis, were by 1981 completely frozen. The United States designated Iran a state sponsor of terrorism and imposed a comprehensive arms embargo. Selling weapons to Iran was the law, not a policy adjustable by a cabinet meeting. But from 1984 onward, Iranian-backed militia groups in Lebanon began kidnapping American citizens, journalists, teachers, CIA personnel, and holding them hostage. By 1986, 7 Americans were being held in Lebanon under brutal conditions. Reagan, who had campaigned partly by criticizing Carter's weakness during the 1979 to 1981 hostage crisis, now was haunted by those same images. He stated publicly that he would not negotiate with terrorists, but privately he was obsessed with those hostages and wanted to bring them home at any cost. The second crisis was in Nicaragua. In 1979, the Sandinista Front overthrew the Somoza dictatorship and established a left-wing, Soviet-aligned government. Reagan viewed this as a communist threat right on America's southern doorstep and began funding the anti-Sandinista rebel forces known as the Contras. But in 1984, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, completely prohibiting all forms of U.S. government support for the Contras. Prohibited meant prohibited, by law, with criminal penalties for anyone who violated it. Reagan signed the Boland Amendment into law, but he did not abandon his goal of supporting the Contras, and Oliver North, sitting at the NSC and considering himself the president's soldier, the executor of the president's will by whatever means necessary, began looking for a way to solve both problems at once. The solution he devised was both clever and insane in the way that only someone truly intelligent could conceive, and only someone lacking judgment about moral and legal limits would dare carry out. The original idea, according to subsequently declassified documents, came from an Israeli intermediary named Manucher Gorbanifar, an exiled Iranian businessman with connections in both Tehran and Tel Aviv. Gorbanifar approached the CIA with a proposal. Iran wanted to buy weapons, specifically Tau anti-tank missiles and Hawk surface-to-air missiles. In return, Iran would use its influence with militia groups in Lebanon to release American hostages. The CIA was initially skeptical and dismissed the proposal. Gorbanifar went to the NSC. He went to Oliver North. North saw in that proposal not merely a transaction, but a mechanism. If the United States sold weapons to Iran through Israel as an intermediary, the proceeds from that transaction, after paying Israel its cost price, could be transferred to a secret account and from there funneled to the Contras. One arrow hitting two targets, freeing the hostages in Lebanon and continuing to fund the Contras without needing any congressionally appropriated budget. In terms of pure logic, this was a clever financial scheme. In legal terms, it violated at least 3 different laws simultaneously: the arms embargo on Iran, the Boland Amendment prohibiting support for the Contras, and the Arms Export Control Act requiring congressional notification of all major arms transactions. In ethical terms, it placed the foreign policy of the world's foremost superpower in the hands of a black market intermediary network whose true motivations no one could monitor. North did not concern himself with any of this. Or more precisely, he did concern himself. He was aware of those violations, but he had convinced himself that the ends justified the means. The Contras were fighting communism. The hostages were suffering in captivity. The country needed him to do things that the law and the system did not permit. So he would do them, and explain later.
What is staggering about Iran-Contra is not that it happened, but the scale and complexity of what one person built from a small office in the old executive office building, a few steps from the White House. North did not merely arrange arms transactions. He constructed an entire independent covert operational infrastructure, a private encrypted communication system and network of bank accounts across multiple countries, shell companies to conceal the origins of funds, warehouses and arms shipment channels that bypassed every government agency, and a personal network, former military officers, private contractors, international intermediaries, operating entirely outside any state oversight. The external operations coordinator was Richard Secord, a retired Air Force general, and Albert Hakim, an Iranian-American businessman. Together, they established what North called the Enterprise, a private paramilitary organization capable of carrying out operations that the U.S. government could not officially conduct. With the Enterprise, North believed he had solved the problem of congressional oversight once and for all. If no federal budget dollars were involved, Congress had nothing to oversee. This is the most dangerous logic in the entire story, and it did not belong to North alone. It is the logic of anyone in history who has ever believed their goals were important enough to justify dismantling the system of checks and balances. North was not an opportunistic liar. He was a genuine true believer in what he was doing, and that is what made him more dangerous than any opportunist could ever be. We need to pause here to address something often overlooked in accounts of Iran-Contra. The Enterprise was not merely a financial instrument. It was a model for something far more dangerous, a parallel government existing alongside the legitimate one,
elected by no one, overseen by no one, and capable of executing actual foreign policy actions, including war. The Contras were not a small force. They were fighting a real civil war in Nicaragua, causing real casualties, and their operations affected America's diplomatic relations with the entire Central American region. And the person deciding how much money they received, how many weapons, and in what strategic direction was not Congress, not the State Department, not even the CIA. It was a Marine lieutenant colonel sitting in an office in Washington, typing into his encrypted KL-43 computer. Every major scandal has small details so strange that if invented, no one would believe them. Iran-Contra had more than its share. In May of 1986, North and former National Security Advisor Robert McFarland secretly flew to Tehran on an unmarked aircraft, carrying Irish false passports, a personal sidearm, and a cake baked in the shape of a key, a symbol the Iranian side had requested as a gesture of goodwill with Islamic symbolic meaning. They also brought a Bible signed by Reagan, a detail North later confirmed was Reagan's own idea, as the president wanted to send a personal message to Iran's leaders. The trip was a complete failure. The Iranians they met turned out not to be actual decision-making officials, but low-level intermediaries looking to bargain for more. McFarland and North sat waiting for hours, then days, in a hotel room in Tehran, the capital of a country under American embargo, with false passports and a cake no one wanted to eat, before finally boarding the plane home empty-handed. When people recount this story, they often laugh, but beneath the absurdity lies something genuinely alarming. Two senior White House officials had secretly traveled to the territory of a hostile nation with false passports without clear congressional authorization on a trip that could have produced catastrophic diplomatic consequences if discovered, and no one in Washington knew or was permitted to know. North had approved for himself arms transactions violating the embargo, money transfers violating the Boland Amendment, unsupervised intelligence operations, direct contact with foreign governments bypassing the State Department, recruitment of private contractors for paramilitary activities, and the construction of a secret financial infrastructure across multiple countries. All of this carried out by a lieutenant colonel, a rank that in any normal system carries no authority to approve a single one of those things. Ironically, North's secret empire was not uncovered by the FBI, not by the CIA, not by any congressional oversight committee, but by a small newspaper in Beirut called Al-Shira. On November 3, 1986, Al-Shira reported that the United States had secretly sold weapons to Iran, and that former National Security Advisor Robert McFarland had traveled to Tehran. Washington initially dismissed the story as rumor, but then details began to be confirmed from multiple independent sources, and the entire web began to vibrate. As the picture became into focus, not only arms sales to Iran, but money transfers to the Contras, the reaction in Washington was seismic. This was not merely a policy scandal. It was evidence that the executive branch had violated laws passed by Congress, that foreign policy had been conducted by people who were neither elected nor subject to oversight, and that the president, whether deliberately or not, had allowed it to happen. This is the most dangerous logic in the entire story, and it did not belong to North alone. It is the logic of anyone in history who has ever believed their goals were important enough to justify dismantling the system of checks and balances. North was not an opportunistic liar. He was a genuine, true believer in what he was doing, and that is what made him more dangerous than any opportunist could ever be. In July of 1987, Oliver North appeared before the Congressional Iran-Contra Investigating Committee, and what followed was one of the most remarkable media performances in the history of modern American politics. North arrived in full Marine dress uniform, chest covered with medals, back straight, eyes forward. He did not sit in a defensive posture. He sat like a soldier reporting on a mission, and when the senators and congressmen began their questioning, he did not evade, did not bow his head, did not shift blame to others. He admitted to nearly everything. Yes, I sold weapons to Iran. Yes, I transferred money to the Contras. Yes, I destroyed documents. And I did all of those things because I believed it was the right thing to do, because I was serving the president, because I was protecting the country. If that is a crime, it is a crime I'm prepared to own. For many members of Congress accustomed to witnesses trying to slip through every question, North's directness looked like courage. Television broadcast the proceedings live for days on end. Phone calls flooded congressional offices from people calling in to defend him. Letters of support poured in by the hundreds of thousands. Even those who disagreed with what he had done had to concede that he looked like a man who genuinely believed in what he was doing. And that is what made him more dangerous than any opportunist could ever be. But beneath that impressive surface, there were things North said in the hearing room that few people paid close attention to, and those were the most troubling things of all. He said he had acted on the authorization of his superiors, but when pressed on who specifically had authorized what, the answers were always vague. Reagan knew, but to what degree was unclear. Poindexter approved, but whether in writing or only verbally remained disputed. North said he had acted alone, but could not identify who actually ordered him to do the specific things that violated the law. This pointed to one of two possibilities. Either North was protecting his superiors by obscuring the chain of authorization, or the chain of authorization was genuinely unclear and he had acted on hints and implications rather than specific orders. Both possibilities are alarming in their distinct ways.
Throughout the investigation, and for decades afterward, the central question was never definitively answered. How much did Ronald Reagan know about the money from arms sales being transferred to the Contras? Poindexter, who ultimately accepted responsibility for the decision to divert the funds, maintained that he had not told Reagan about the Contra-specific portion in order to protect the president's plausible deniability. Reagan consistently maintained he had no knowledge of the money transfer. Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh ultimately could not prove Reagan had directly approved the diversion. But there were things Reagan certainly knew. He knew about the arms sales to Iran, because he had personally signed approval for at least some of those transactions. He knew he wanted the Contras to continue receiving support despite the congressional ban because he said so in internal meetings. And he knew his team was finding creative ways to ensure the Contras were not abandoned, because that was the language used in internal memos he had read. Did he genuinely not know that creative ways included violating the law? Historians remain divided. Some argue that Reagan, who by that point had begun showing signs of what would be officially diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease in 1994, was genuinely not tracking enough detail to know. Others argue this was deliberate, plausible deniability, a system designed so the president need not know the specifics, enabling full denial when needed. Both scenarios are troubling in their own ways. If Reagan did not know, then the White House oversight system had failed to the point where a lieutenant colonel could conduct large-scale foreign policy without the conscious approval of the head of the executive branch. If Reagan did know, then an American president had directed the violation of a law he himself had signed. In 1988, North was indicted on 16 criminal counts. In 1989, he was convicted on 3 of them: obstructing Congress, destroying documents, and accepting an illegal gratuity, a security screen installed at his home paid for by the enterprise. He was fined $150,000 and sentenced to 1,200 hours of community service. But in 1990, the Court of Appeals overturned the entire conviction on a technical ground. Witnesses at trial may have been influenced by North's immunized congressional testimony, and that violated his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. On a legal technicality, North had won. In practical terms, he never spent a single day in prison. What followed is one of the strangest parts of the story. North did not disappear into disgrace. He became a prominent media and political figure. He ran for the U.S. Senate in Virginia in 1994 and nearly won, losing to incumbent Senator Charles Robb by a narrow margin. He became a well-known conservative radio host, then a presenter on Fox News programs. In 2018, he was elected president of the National Rifle Association, a position he held for nearly a year before resigning over internal disagreements. North has never expressed regret. In dozens of interviews across many decades, he has maintained a single consistent position. He did the right thing. The system was wrong to criminalize patriotic behavior, and if given the chance to do it again, he would do exactly the same. Oliver North was not insane in any clinical sense. He was not an ordinary corrupt figure enriching himself. The documentation shows he took no personal financial benefit from the entire elaborate scheme. He was a true believer.
and that is precisely what made him the most dangerous figure in any democratic institution. Someone who acts outside the law, not out of greed, but out of conviction. Iran-Contra revealed a deep structural flaw in the American system of power. The NSC, an unelected body, not directly overseen by Congress, operating in the gray zone between the president and all other executive agencies, could become a place where policy was executed without passing through any democratic process. After Iran-Contra, Congress tightened some regulations, but the fundamental structural vulnerability remained. And the most alarming lesson from North's story is not how much damage one person can do, but how completely a system can fail when the people inside it believe their goals are noble enough to justify any means. No grand conspiracy is required, no gathering of many bad actors. Only one person sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently passionate, and sufficiently convinced that they know what is better for their country is enough to shatter the principles on which the Republic was built. Oliver North never understood that, and that perhaps is his true tragedy. Not the scandal, not the trial, not the years spent in the shadow of a parallel government, but the reality that a man of genuine courage and genuine intelligence wasted both on undermining the very thing he claimed to be protecting.
Number 6. William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam.
Some wars are lost on the battlefield, some are lost at the negotiating table, and some were lost right inside the conference rooms of Washington. Lost because the people standing before maps reported things that were not true. Lost because numbers were prettied up to please those above. Lost because a general looked at the chaotic reality of guerrilla warfare in a tropical jungle and decided to reframe it as an industrial war he knew how to win. The Vietnam War was lost in all three of those ways. But the third, the way of William Childs Westmoreland, was perhaps the most dangerous, because it did not only kill people on the battlefield, it killed a system's ability to recognize truth, to adjust and change before it was too late. Westmoreland was not a coward, he was not corrupt, he was not clinically deranged, he was something more dangerous, a talented, supremely confident man whom the system rewarded for optimism, and who, over time, began to believe in what he himself had created. William Childs Westmoreland was born in 1914 in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, a southern community where military tradition was not a career choice, but a family and communal identity. His grandfather had served in the Civil War. His father was a man of standing and respect in the region. From adolescence, Westmoreland already knew his path, the military. He entered West Point in 1932, graduating in 1936 near the top of his class. What people remembered about Westmoreland at West Point was not intellectual brilliance, though he was a good student, but his appearance and bearing. He looked like someone drawn to illustrate the word general. Tall, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, cold blue eyes, posture as straight as a ruler. He understood military ceremony as a native language, presenting himself in every context with a confidence that admitted no trace of doubt. In World War II, he fought in North Africa and Europe as an artillery officer, accumulating enough field experience that no one could call him a desk general. In the Korean War, he commanded an infantry regiment and was commended for leadership under pressure. By the 1950s, he was one of the fastest rising officers in the American military, becoming a major general in 1956 at the age of 42, one of the youngest to reach that rank in peacetime. In 1960, he was appointed superintendent of West Point, the most prestigious position in the American education system, reserved for those considered the future of the armed forces. He reformed the curriculum, modernized the facilities, and left in 1963 with a soaring reputation. When President Johnson needed someone to command the escalating war in Vietnam, the name Westmoreland appeared as the natural choice. He arrived in Saigon in 1964, and from the very first days, he looked at this war in a way that would shape and ultimately destroy everything he did in the 4 years that followed. To understand why Westmoreland failed, one must understand how he approached the Vietnam War, and why that approach, even if executed flawlessly, could not lead to victory. Westmoreland was a product of conventional warfare doctrine, the kind of war America had studied, practiced, and won in 2 world wars. In that doctrine, victory was measured by territory captured, enemy forces destroyed, and the adversary's will to fight broken by overwhelming superiority in firepower, logistics, and technology. America had all of those things by any measure: troop numbers, weapons, aircraft, budget, supply lines. On paper, this was not a war America could lose. But Vietnam was not that kind of war. The National Liberation Front and the People's Army of Vietnam were not fighting to hold territory. They were fighting to survive, to maintain a presence, to erode the enemy's will over time. They did not need to win every engagement. They only needed to avoid losing fast enough that America would tire and go home. This was the strategy that had already been successfully used to defeat the French, and it rested on a deep understanding of a superpower's single greatest vulnerability: the impatience of domestic public opinion. Westmoreland did not understand this, or understood it but did not know how to do anything other than what he had been trained to do. He built a strategy of search and destroy based on a simple assumption: if America killed enough of the enemy, at some point the other side would run out of people to fight. Victory was measured by body count, the number of enemy dead tallied after each engagement. Every week, every month, reports on enemy killed were compiled and sent to Washington as evidence of progress. This is the point where the entire system began to rot from its roots. When victory is defined by a single number, body count, and when an officer's career advancement depends on reporting that number high, you do not need anyone of bad intent to produce a system of systematic false reporting. You only need human beings operating the way human beings always do: wanting praise, wanting promotion, and wanting to avoid the trouble that comes with reporting bad news.
To understand the false reporting machinery of the Vietnam War, start at the lowest level, the infantrymen after a firefight in the jungle. After an engagement, a platoon commander had to report the number of enemy killed. In many cases, the firefight had happened at night in dense jungle. The enemy had withdrawn quickly and taken their dead with them. The officer could not actually count bodies. He could only estimate based on bloodstains, abandoned equipment, and the volume of fire exchanged. If he reported a low number, his superior would ask, "Why did you engage and kill so few?" If he reported a high number, his superior was satisfied and asked nothing further. After enough repetitions, the practical lesson became clear: reporting high is safer. That number traveled up to company level, then battalion, then brigade, then division. At each level, the number was never reduced. It was either held constant or added to as reports from multiple units were consolidated. By the time the number reached Saigon, by the time it reached Westmoreland's desk, it had passed through at least 5 or 6 reporting levels, each with its own incentive not to make it smaller. Field officers knew this. Many of them were uncomfortable but did not know what else to do inside a system that evaluated them based on that number. Some refused to participate and found their careers affected. Some spoke up and were told they lacked team spirit or didn't understand the ground situation. But the problem ran deeper than numerical distortion. There was a more fundamental question that no one inside Westmoreland's system was permitted to ask aloud. Even if the body count were accurate, was the search and destroy strategy actually working? Because what intelligence analysts, those outside the direct military reporting chain, recognized fairly early on was this: North Vietnam and the Liberation Front could replenish their forces faster than the rate at which America was destroying them. They had the population, the will, and the time. America did not have enough of the last one. The search and destroy strategy assumed the enemy had a finite number of people and that once enough of them died, they would give up. But North Vietnam was not fighting by that logic. They adjusted the tempo of engagement to control their own casualties. When pressure became too great, they withdrew and waited. When American attention relaxed, they returned. Body count did not measure will to fight, did not measure capacity to reorganize, and did not measure the one thing that truly mattered: whether the people of South Vietnam supported Saigon. From 1965 to 1967, Westmoreland carried out a series of visits to Washington and appearances before the press that, viewed in retrospect, are difficult to believe were describing the same war as what was actually happening on the ground. In November of 1967, just months before the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland flew back to Washington on a trip specifically designed to shore up public support for a war facing growing opposition. He spoke before the National Press Club, he appeared on television programs, and every time he brought the same message: we're winning. He said the body count was rising and the enemy was exhausted. He said the rural pacification program was making progress. He said the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was growing stronger and would soon be able to shoulder the bulk of the fighting burden. And he said the sentence that would become one of the most famous and most humiliating in the history of American warfare: we have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view. The press reported it, public opinion was temporarily mollified, Johnson exhaled, and Westmoreland flew back to Saigon to continue the war he had just described as trending toward victory. 8 weeks later, on the night of January 30, 1968, the eve of the Lunar New Year, more than 80,000 North Vietnamese and Liberation Front forces attacked more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously across South Vietnam, including the American Embassy in Saigon. The lighthead at the end of the tunnel turned out to be the headlamp of a train coming straight at them. The 1968 Tet Offensive was one of the defining events of the 20th century, not because it was a military victory for North Vietnam, but because it was an information catastrophe for Westmoreland and the White House. In purely military terms, Tet was actually a devastating defeat for North Vietnam and the Liberation Front. They lost more than 50,000 men in the attacks. They had expected the people of South Vietnam to rise up in support, which did not happen. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled all the assaults within weeks. Not a single major city fell for long. By conventional military criteria, this was an American victory. But in terms of information and psychology, it was an unrecoverable disaster. For a very simple reason. The American people had just been told by Westmoreland and the White House that the enemy was exhausted, that the war was being won, that the light at the end of the tunnel was glimmering, and then they turned on their televisions and watched Viet Cong fighters firing inside the compound of the American Embassy in Saigon. That was an image that could not be explained away by any means. If the enemy was exhausted, how had they managed to organize a simultaneous attack on more than 100 locations? If the situation was under control, how had they penetrated the most symbolic building of American presence in Vietnam? The obvious answer that the government had been lying required no one to spell it out. The American people drew that conclusion themselves as they stared at their screens. Walter Cronkite, the CBS news anchor whom Americans had voted the most trusted man in the country in multiple surveys, flew to Vietnam to see for himself. He returned and, in a special broadcast, broke the journalistic tradition of reporting without editorializing to say plainly, "This war is mired in stalemate. America is not winning and probably will not win." When Johnson watched that broadcast, he turned to his aide and spoke the famous words, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America."
What is remarkable and far less widely known is that just before the Tet Offensive, a fierce debate had been burning inside the American intelligence community about precisely what Westmoreland was reporting. In 1967, the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, conducted independent assessments of the true size of enemy forces in Vietnam. Their findings differed from the figures produced by MACV, Westmoreland's military command, in a stunning way. While MACV reported approximately 270,000 regular and irregular enemy combatants, the CIA estimated the true number at between 500,000 and 600,000 when local militia forces and political infrastructure were included. That difference was not a technical matter. It was a question of strategic survival. If the CIA was right, Westmoreland's attrition strategy had no basis in reality because the American rate of killing could not keep pace with North Vietnam's rate of mobilization. Sam Adams, the CIA intelligence analyst responsible for Vietnam, spent months compiling evidence that MACV was systematically underestimating enemy troop strength in order to create the illusion of progress. He brought that evidence to his superiors. He was heard and asked not to circulate his conclusions widely because they would contradict the official narrative being constructed by Westmoreland in the White House. Westmoreland later dismissed these accusations, characterizing the disagreements over figures as normal technical disputes between agencies. In 1982, CBS broadcast a documentary titled The Uncounted Enemy of Vietnam Deception, alleging that Westmoreland had systematically falsified the numbers. Westmoreland sued CBS for defamation, seeking $120 million in damages. The lawsuit dragged on for 4 years, and after most of the evidence had been presented before the court, Westmoreland abruptly withdrew his suit before the jury reached a verdict. No one knows for certain why, but many lawyers observing the case concluded he did not want a jury rendering a verdict on the truthfulness of the accusations. After Tet, while Americans were still reeling from the shock of reality, Westmoreland put forward a request that even the war's supporters inside the White House received with alarm. He wanted 206,000 more troops. His logic was, once again, entirely consistent with his attrition thinking. Tet had inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. This was the moment to intensify the pressure and end the war. With 206,000 additional troops, he could shift from defense to full-scale counteroffensive and reach the breaking point of the adversary. That request was leaked to the New York Times before Johnson had time to make a decision. The paper ran it on the front page. The American public's reaction was seismic. This was the moment the internal contradiction of Westmoreland's entire strategy became visible in its most painful form. If the light at the end of the tunnel was glimmering as he had said in November, why did he now need 206,000 more troops? If the enemy had just been badly defeated in Tet, as MacV reported, why did escalation require yet another surge? There was no logical answer to both questions simultaneously, and without a logical answer, the entire story of progress in the light at the end of the tunnel shattered before the eyes of the American public. Johnson, facing a growing anti-war movement, senators from his own party turning against him, and catastrophically falling approval ratings, understood that Westmoreland was becoming a political burden he could no longer carry. In July of 1968, he recalled Westmoreland to Washington and promoted him to Army Chief of Staff, a position that sounded like advancement but was in reality a quiet removal from Vietnam.
Few people know that among the proposals Westmoreland sent up to Washington during the most desperate phase of the war, there was one that even his strongest supporters fell silent about when it was mentioned decades later. In early 1968, when the base at Khe Sanh was surrounded by tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops, and many feared that would become America's Dien Bien Phu, the place where France had been catastrophically defeated in 1954, Westmoreland and his staff drafted a secret contingency plan codenamed Fractured Jaw. That plan studied the possibility of deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam if the situation escalated beyond control. Westmoreland later acknowledged he had asked the Pentagon to study this possibility, but emphasized that he had not actually proposed using them, only wanting a contingency option available. When Johnson learned of the plan, his reaction, according to those present in the meeting, was a fury rarely seen from him. He ordered the plan scrapped immediately and prohibited any further study. He understood what Westmoreland appeared not to fully grasp. The deployment of nuclear weapons in Vietnam, regardless of how small in scale, would alter the nature of the conflict in ways that were both unpredictable and irreversible, with the risk of drawing China and the Soviet Union in directly. Once again, as with MacArthur in Korea, as with LeMay during Cuba, one sees the same pattern of thinking. When backed into a corner, the first step in the minds of certain American generals was to escalate to the level of weapons of mass destruction, in the belief that the enemy would retreat before absolute force. And each time it was the civilian statesmen, Johnson, Kennedy, Truman, who had to be the ones to hold the line. Westmoreland retired in 1972 and lived for another 33 years, dying in 2005 at the age of 91. In those 3 decades, he persistently defended his decisions with a consistency that would be almost admirable, were it not for the substance of what he was defending. He published his memoirs in 1976 under the title A Soldier Reports, in which he argued that America had fought with its hands tied by political constraints, that his strategy had been fundamentally sound but was undermined by a lack of resolve in Washington, and that the ultimate failure in Vietnam was not the fault of the military, but of politicians and domestic public opinion. This is the stab-in-the-back argument, a version of the narrative that German generals used after World War I to explain why they had lost. Not a weak military, but enemies within who had sabotaged the effort. In Germany, that argument helped pave the way for the rise of fascism. In America, the Vietnam version was less catastrophic in its political consequences, but it was still a refusal to accept responsibility by the man who should have accepted the most of it. There were generals from the Vietnam War who looked back and genuinely asked hard questions of themselves. Harold Moore, who commanded at the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, the first major engagement between American and regular North Vietnamese forces, wrote, "We were soldiers once and young, with a level of honesty about hardship, uncertainty, and moral complexity that few senior commanders could match." Colin Powell, then a junior officer in Vietnam, later said plainly that he had witnessed the false reporting system from the inside, and that it was one of the formative experiences shaping how he thought about the responsibilities of leadership. Westmoreland did none of that. He continued to believe he had acted correctly, that the numbers were right, and that his critics were people who simply did not understand the reality of war. There's a cruel paradox at the center of Westmoreland's story. The Vietnam War, in purely military terms, was not a complete defeat in the field. America lost very few major engagements by conventional criteria. What actually happened was that the war was lost on the terrain of information and will. The gap between what the government said and what the American people saw on their televisions grew too wide to be filled by any proclamation. Westmoreland did not create that gap alone. The entire system, from Johnson in the White House down to the most junior officer reporting body counts in the jungle, built it together. But Westmoreland, as the supreme field commander, bore the greatest responsibility for failing to correct it while correction was still possible. The lessons the American military drew from Vietnam were complex and took decades to fully form. Part of that lesson, crystallized in what became Colin Powell's doctrine, was never enter a war without clear objectives, without an exit strategy, without public support, and without the will to use overwhelming force to end it quickly. That doctrine, however imperfect, reflected what had been learned from what Westmoreland did and failed to do. But the most important lesson was not about strategy or tactics, it was about information. When a general, or any leader, constructs a system of measurement that creates pressure to report better than reality, and when that system operates long enough, the person at the top of that system begins to believe their own numbers. Westmoreland was not a calculating liar from the beginning. He was someone who gradually lost contact with reality inside a system designed to insulate him from it. And by the time Tet happened, the gap between the map in his mind and the map on the actual ground had grown too wide for anyone to bridge. That is why Westmoreland's story is not only the story of one man, it is the story of an entire information system inside a long war, and a warning that when that system breaks down, the price paid is not merely the career of one general, but tens of thousands of lives and the faith of an entire generation in the people who led them.
Number 7. Edward Lansdale, U.S. Air Force Brigadier General, CIA advisor, and the architect of Operation Mongoose. Throughout CIA history, which has seen many strange and audacious plans, one operation stands out as particularly memorable: Operation Mongoose. It was not the most dangerous plan, nor the one with the greatest consequences. But what made it different was how clearly it illustrated what can happen when a very intelligent person, given too much power and pressed to succeed, begins generating ideas that no one dares to stop or call out as completely insane. The man behind it all was Edward Geary Lansdale. He devised a series of plans that, when the documents were eventually declassified, proved to be simultaneously astonishing in their creativity and staggering in their strangeness. Had people not known these were genuine government records, many would have assumed they were the plot of a comedy film. Yet every bit of it was real, and what made it truly alarming was that these ideas once came perilously close to pushing the entire world to the brink of a new world war. Edward Lansdale was born in 1908 in Detroit. Before becoming an intelligence operative, he worked in advertising in San Francisco. That may sound unrelated, but the job taught him a very particular skill: making people believe things they had never believed, fear things they had never feared, and desire things they had never considered. In short, he knew how to construct an alternative reality inside someone else's mind. When he entered the world of intelligence, he brought that skill with him and applied it in ways few could have anticipated. During World War II, he worked for the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, where he learned methods of warfare that required no guns or bullets, acting directly on the human psyche instead. After the war, he was sent to the Philippines, which was in turmoil due to a communist peasant insurgency known as the Hukbalahap. By that point, large swaths of the countryside had fallen under the movement's control. Lansdale's task was to help the Philippine government restore order. Rather than resorting to firepower, however, he chose a very different approach. He studied local culture carefully and discovered that the population believed in a terrifying creature from folklore known as the Aswang, a vampire-like entity said to drain people of their blood. From this, he devised a plan that sent a chill down the spine of anyone who heard it. When his team learned that a particular village was sympathetic to the Hook forces, they would secretly take the body of a dead Hook fighter, drain his blood, create 2 wounds on his neck resembling an Aswang attack, and leave the body where his comrades were sure to find it. The goal was not to kill more people, but to spread fear, and spread it did. Many Hook soldiers began to believe their area was haunted, and their terror ran so deep that they fled and never returned. Strange as it sounds, the method worked. Several insurgent units gradually fell apart from fear alone. Lansdale returned home with a reputation as a psychological warfare wizard, someone who could defeat an enemy without firing a single shot. Years later, when tensions with Cuba escalated, his name surfaced again as an almost obvious choice. To understand why Operation Mongoose came into being, one must go back to the atmosphere in Washington, thick with frustration and fury following the catastrophic failure at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. The plan to land a force of Cuban exiles on the island, conceived under Dwight Eisenhower and carried forward by John F. Kennedy, had collapsed entirely. Roughly 1,400 trained and well-equipped fighters came ashore, but within 72 hours they were routed by Cuban forces. Many then killed, more than 1,000 were captured, and the world watched and saw the CIA as incompetent and Kennedy as inexperienced. Castro, meanwhile, became a hero. He had held firm against an operation tied to the most powerful nation on Earth, and that made him admired not only in Cuba, but across much of the developing world. Kennedy was furious, the fury of a brilliant man cornered in a situation beyond his control. At one point, he reportedly told aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Yet, no matter how great his anger, blaming the CIA did nothing to change reality. Castro was still there, barely 150 kilometers from the Florida coast, and growing ever closer to the Soviet Union, steadily becoming a symbol of anti-American resistance in the eyes of many nations. It was the president's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, serving as Attorney General, who pushed hardest for a new plan. He wanted something done to change the situation, and he wanted it done quickly. He also wanted it entrusted to the best people available. In November 1961, Kennedy officially approved a covert operation called Mongoose. Edward Lansdale was put in charge. The operation came with a substantial budget, roughly $50 million a year, and hundreds of participants, drawn from the CIA, the military, and various contractors. The objective was stated plainly: overthrow Castro's government before October 1962. And so, Lansdale began thinking about how to accomplish a task that was by almost any measure
nearly impossible.
When the classified documents on Operation Mongoose were gradually released, particularly following the Church Committee investigation and successive declassification efforts by the U.S. National Archives, many readers were left genuinely stunned. At times, they had to stop, read passages over again, just to be sure they were not mistakenly reading a work of science fiction, because what lay within those pages was truly extraordinary. What made it all the more striking was that these plans were not the impulsive ideas of someone with time to kill. They were written up with great seriousness, laid out with clear analysis, and submitted to figures as powerful as Robert F. Kennedy and occasionally the president himself. Some were approved for further consideration, others were rejected, but usually because they were too dangerous, not because they were too absurd. Take, for instance, the idea of preparing a specially made cigar to be delivered to Fidel Castro. Hidden inside would be an explosive charge, powerful enough to kill, yet concealed with enough precision to escape detection. Technicians studied carefully which type of explosive to use and how to size it to fit within the cigar. In the end, the plan was abandoned because no reliable method could be found to ensure the lethal gift would actually reach Castro's hands. Another scheme was even more elaborate. Because Castro was an avid diver, someone proposed presenting him with a diving suit. Ordinary enough on the surface, but the suit's interior was to be treated with a fungus capable of causing a skin disease, while the breathing apparatus would be laced with poison. If Castro used it, he would fall ill and be poisoned without ever knowing why. Everything was nearly ready when the plan was scrapped at the last moment, simply because the communication channel had changed. There were also ideas aimed at undermining Castro's image. His beard was not merely a physical feature, but a symbol, and so plans were drawn up to use chemicals that would cause all of his facial hair to fall out. Were that to happen in public, the thinking went his authority would crumble along with it. The plan was actually approved for testing, but it too collapsed when no way could be found to access his personal belongings. Then there was the idea of introducing a hallucinogenic substance into the broadcast studio where Castro regularly delivered his radio addresses, the goal being to make him speak incoherently before millions of listeners, shattering his image as a commanding leader. This plan was shelved because no one could be confident of controlling the dosage or the timing of its effects. One of the strangest ideas of all involved staging a fake miracle. The plan called for firing flares into the skies over Havana, then spreading word that this was a divine sign, God descending to punish Cuba. The hope was that the population would panic and turn against Castro. In the end, the plan was vetoed because someone recognized that the Cuban people were unlikely to be fooled so easily. Also inspired by Castro's love of diving, someone proposed planting a bomb on the seafloor disguised as a brightly colored shell of the kind he typically picked up while diving. Should he happen to reach for it, the bomb would detonate. Outlandish as it sounds, it was a real plan, one that was ultimately dropped because no one could guarantee Castro would pick up that particular shell. Even seemingly ordinary objects were turned into instruments of death. A pen was engineered so that pressing its button would fire a tiny needle, injecting poison into whoever was on the receiving end. The pen was actually manufactured and handed to an operative in the hope of getting close to Castro, but the plan unraveled when the operative was deemed unreliable. The intelligence agencies even turned to the mafia. They made contact with crime bosses such as Sam Giancana and Santos Trafficante Jr., men who had lost substantial interests in Cuba after Castro came to power. They were paid to organize assassination attempts. Multiple plots were drawn up, from poisoning food to various other methods, but every one of them failed. Looking back, these plans reveal both the intensity of that era's tensions and the sheer disbelief they inspire in hindsight. Because sometimes the line between reality and fiction turns out to be far thinner than anyone would expect.
Reading through that catalog of bizarre schemes, one cannot help but wonder, who exactly was sitting in those meeting rooms, nodding along to ideas that sounded like they had watched straight out of a science fiction novel? Things like apocalypse flares or the killer seashell. The answer is actually quite straightforward. Not just one person, but many, over a long enough stretch of time that all of these ideas were set down in official documents, and in some cases, forwarded all the way to the White House. Edward Lansdale was not a man given to idle fantasy. On the contrary, he had been rigorously trained to think in unconventional ways, because that was precisely the nature of his work in psychological warfare. To him, a fertile imagination was an asset, but the problem lay in the environment in which he was operating, which at that moment was under enormous strain. After the Bay of Pigs failure, everyone was under pressure to produce results, and quickly. Robert Kennedy kept pressing for updates, making the atmosphere still more suffocating. In such conditions, no one wanted to stand up and admit they had nothing to offer. And so, as time went on, the ideas being put forward drifted further and further from reality. There is a little-known account of what those meetings were actually like. A CIA official named Sam Halpern later recalled that during sessions with Robert Kennedy, he would repeatedly slam his fist on the table and demand that something be done about Castro. The pressure from above rippled downward through the entire apparatus. When the person giving you orders is the president's brother and he is furious, it is very difficult to sit calmly and say that something cannot be done. Instead, you feel compelled to keep generating ideas, even as those ideas grow increasingly untethered from reality. Lansdale was both the architect of that system and someone swept up in its own pressures. He worked nearly around the clock, flying constantly between Washington and Miami, managing a sprawling network of operatives and collaborators. Report after report, memorandum after memorandum was produced to demonstrate that the operation was still moving forward. Yet, even those inside it understood, on some level, that the plan had almost no real chance of succeeding from the start. Beyond the almost cinematic assassination plots, Operation Mongoose had another dimension that received far less attention, yet produced real effects in the real world. These were sabotage operations. At the time, the CIA was secretly supporting and training Cuban exiles living in Florida. These groups were sent back into Cuba to carry out nighttime raids. They burned sugarcane warehouses, struck oil facilities, sabotaged cargo shipments, and disrupted trade. Over roughly 2 years, from 1961 to 1963, dozens of such operations took place, inflicting considerable damage on the Cuban economy. Beyond that, the CIA waged a broader campaign of what might be called economic warfare. It worked to spoil sugar shipments that Cuba was exporting, sabotage machinery Cuba was importing from the West, and cut off sources of revenue. The goal was to drive the Cuban economy into severe crisis in the hopes that the population would rise up against Fidel Castro of their own accord. But things did not unfold as planned. Economic crisis does not always turn people against their government. Sometimes it draws them closer together against an outside enemy. And Fidel Castro made excellent use of exactly that dynamic. He repeatedly told his people that Cuba's hardships were the result of the American blockade. That claim was not entirely wrong, given that the CIA was indeed quietly strangling the Cuban economy from the outside. In April 1961, the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion left President John F. Kennedy furious. He vowed that Cuba would not be left in peace, while the CIA suffered a severe blow to its credibility. By November of that same year, Operation Mongoose was formally launched under Edward Lansdale's direction, backed by a substantial budget and a clearly defined goal to overthrow Fidel Castro by October 1962. Throughout 1962, plans multiplied. Sabotage operations and raids continued without pause, but the assassination plots yielded nothing. Then, at precisely that moment, the world was plunged into one of its most dangerous passages, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Faced with the prospect of nuclear war, Kennedy was forced to suspend the entire operation. Many historians have since argued that it was the very activities of Operation Mongoose that convinced the Soviet Union Cuba was under threat, and that this conviction drove the decision to deploy nuclear missiles there. By early 1963, the operation was officially shut down, and Lansdale was removed from his role. Even so, efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro continued quietly for many years afterward. It was not until 1975, when the Church Committee released its classified findings, that the world learned of schemes such as the exploding cigar and the poison-laced diving suit.
The American public was deeply shocked. They had not imagined that behind the facade of political decision-making lay stories so difficult to believe. This is the part of the story that not everyone pays attention to, yet it matters far more than many of the smaller details surrounding it. In 1962, when Nikita Khrushchev decided to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, many assumed he was simply seeking to balance the American missiles stationed in Turkey. That is true, but it is not the whole story. Years later, in his memoirs, Khrushchev wrote that what troubled him most was the possibility that the United States would attack Cuba again, and that this time it would not be Cuban exiles as before, but actual American military forces. That fear did not arise from nowhere. Viewed from Havana or from Moscow, it was plain to see the United States was applying pressure on Cuba by every available means: sabotage, support for armed groups, and plots to bring down Fidel Castro. Placing yourself in Khrushchev's position at that moment, watching all of this unfold, it would have been very difficult to believe that Washington had no intention of launching an attack. For Khrushchev, then, stationing missiles in Cuba was not merely a bargaining chip against the Americans. It was more like a shield, protection for Cuba against an invasion he believed was being prepared. And the reason he believed it was being prepared was a covert American campaign called Operation Mongoose, with its steady drumbeat of raids, sabotage operations, and overthrow schemes playing out just off America's own coast. The bitter irony was that a campaign designed to eliminate the threat from Cuba inadvertently created a far greater danger. When nuclear missiles appeared barely 150 kilometers from American shores, the world was suddenly pushed to the edge. And during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, humanity came closer to the brink of nuclear war than at almost any other moment in history. In 1975, a senator named Frank Church led an extraordinary Senate investigation, one that was not looking into minor matters, but scrutinizing what the CIA had been quietly doing for more than 20 years. It was the first time in American history that Congress truly turned its gaze on the CIA and demanded clear answers. As the investigation unfolded, what came to light stunned Washington and the world alike. Not because such things were entirely unimaginable in the context of the Cold War, but because they had come from a country that never stopped speaking of democracy and the rule of law. It emerged that the CIA had plotted to assassinate Fidel Castro not once, but at least 8 times in operations that had been seriously prepared. The agency had even collaborated with the mafia and carried out large-scale campaigns of economic sabotage. More striking still was the finding that none of this had been the work of a rogue group acting on its own initiative. The committee established that at least 3 American presidents, Dwight E. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson, had known about these activities, or had at least tacitly permitted them to continue. There is, however, one question that remains unresolved to this day. Precisely how much did John F. Kennedy himself know about the assassination plots? It appears he was aware that the CIA was working to remove Castro, but whether he knew the details of each specific plan remains a matter of debate. This touches on a particular political practice known as plausible deniability, whereby those at the top deliberately avoid learning too much so that they cannot later be held accountable. When a man named Edward Lansdale was called to testify, he responded with remarkable composure, candid even, in a way that surprised many. He did not deny the plans. Instead, he explained that the United States at that time felt itself threatened by the spread of communism, and in a steady, unhesitating voice, he said that he had simply done what he believed his country needed him to do. To be fair, not everything Lansdale did throughout his career was mere theater or outlandish scheming. He had genuine successes as well, and it was precisely those successes that earned him people's trust, and with it ever greater authority, which in turn gave him the latitude to attempt things that were bold and at times bordering on the reckless.
In the Philippines, he had deployed psychological warfare against insurgent forces. Some of his methods were controversial. The Aswang story, for instance, left many people genuinely terrified. But there was no denying that those strategies helped isolate the Hook movement and contributed to stabilizing the country. Lansdale understood something that many American generals of that era had yet to grasp. In those kinds of wars, what mattered was not how much territory you captured, but whether you could win the trust of the people. Sometimes understanding human psychology proved more effective than firepower. When he arrived in Vietnam, before the United States committed its forces to full-scale war, Lansdale worked to help Ngo Dinh Diem build a South Vietnamese government strong enough to command genuine popular support. His aim was to create an administration capable of standing on its own rather than one perpetually dependent on America. In the end, he did not succeed, partly because Diem could not attract broad support from the population, and partly because American policy at the time was inconsistent and unclear. Despite the failure, Lansdale's core idea that you had to build real political foundations from within the country itself was later judged by many to have been sound. His influence even reached into literature. In Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, the central character is widely believed to have been drawn partly from Lansdale. That character is a young American, brimming with faith in the ideals of freedom and democracy, always convinced he is doing the right thing. But it is precisely that unshakable conviction, combined with a failure to understand the reality around him, that makes everything worse. What Greene captured so early seemed to reflect not only Lansdale, but an entire generation of Americans, people who carried their mission with them wherever they went, yet never stopped asking whether the places they arrived in actually needed or wanted what they had brought.
In 1963, when Operation Mongoose came to an end, Lansdale stepped away from his work and retired. He lived for many more years, passing away in 1987. His final years were quiet ones. He spent them writing a memoir titled In the Midst of Wars, recounting his experiences in the Philippines and Vietnam, but saying almost nothing about Cuba or the controversial assassination plots. He died before many of the classified Mongoose documents were made public, so he never had to watch stories about exploding cigars and killer seashells splash across front pages around the world. In a sense, one might say he was spared the experience of confronting before a public audience those accounts that left people equal parts astonished and disbelieving. Fidel Castro, meanwhile, the man at the center of hundreds of assassination plots, lived to a very old age, dying in 2016 at 90. He outlasted many American presidents, including John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon, and he outlasted Lansdale himself. In the end, no cigar ever exploded, no diving suit ever poisoned anyone, and no flare display ever convinced the Cuban people they were witnessing something miraculous. The story of Lansdale and Operation Mongoose is not really just a story about intelligence work or secret plots. It reads more like a lesson about human nature and how organizations function. Throughout the operation, there was no shortage of intelligent people who recognized that many of the ideas on the table were plainly absurd. The problem was that no one dared say so out loud. People who were there have recalled that in those meetings, some of the plans were strange enough to draw quiet laughter. But when Robert F. Kennedy was pressing hard and visibly furious, no one wanted to be the person who pushed back. No one wanted to say plainly, "We have nothing that will actually work." And so proposals kept coming, plans kept being written, reports kept being sent upward. The machine kept running, but no one dared pull the brake. This points to a lesson that is hard to learn, but difficult to forget. When pressure from above becomes so intense that honest feedback is no longer welcome, the result is not better plans. It is the opposite. Ideas that sound formidable on paper, but are completely untethered from reality, until eventually no one can tell genuine creativity from pure fantasy. In later years, Castro himself would refer to the assassination plots in a tone that was almost playful. Heard from the outside, these stories do have a certain dark absurdity to them. But the most important thing to reflect on is not the seashell bomb or the exploding cigar. It is this. All of it was produced by a superpower with vast resources, cutting-edge technology, and some of the sharpest minds available. And yet, what they came up with in the end was something that belonged in a science fiction film.
Number 8. Thomas Power, Commander of the Strategic Air Command, SAC.
In the military history of 20th century America, there were many dangerous figures, but among all those men, Thomas Sarsfield Power was a very special case. Not because he was the most famous, nor because he caused a disaster during his lifetime. What made him different lay in a far more unsettling detail. There was a man named Curtis LeMay. He once ordered the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II. He also wanted to strike the Soviet Union before they could prepare. Throughout his life, LeMay always believed that destructive force was the answer to every problem. A man that hardened and extreme, yet he said that Thomas Power was someone who lacked the necessary balance. At this point, he might want to pause and think. If someone as cold-blooded as LeMay found Power to be off, what must Power have been like? And there was also Daniel Ellsberg, a renowned analyst, later known for leaking the Pentagon Papers. But before that, after just one meeting with Thomas Power, he returned and told his colleagues, "I just met the first genuine madman of my life." The most frightening thing of all was that a man like this held enormous power. For 7 of the most tense years of the Cold War, Thomas Power controlled nearly 3,000 nuclear warheads, along with the entire U.S. strategic bomber force. The story of Thomas Power is not just the story of one man. It is also a warning about what can happen when a system places the wrong person in a position of too much power, and no one recognizes the mistake until it is far too late. Thomas Power was born in 1905 in New York. His path into the military was similar to many young men of that era, not through prestigious institutions like West Point or Annapolis, but through training as a reserve pilot. In 1928, he began learning to fly. Those who flew alongside him shared a common observation. Power disliked complexity. He preferred things clear and simple. Right was right, wrong was wrong. Once he had a course of action, he acted immediately, without hesitation, and without any patience for what-if questions getting in the way. When World War II came, Power served under Curtis LeMay in the bombing campaigns against Japan in the Pacific. He personally commanded numerous missions, including the napalm bombings of Japanese cities in 1945. From LeMay, Power learned one thing clearly: hit hard, hit fast, without hesitation, and without mercy. But what he learned was only surface level. He absorbed the toughness and the belief in destructive force, yet never learned to think deeply or weigh consequences, something LeMay, however aggressive, always did as a true strategist. LeMay trusted Power enough to elevate him, but knew him well enough to feel uneasy. Later, in a conversation, LeMay once said of Power that he does very well when given a task, but is not good at asking questions. It sounds like a compliment, but it wasn't. In ordinary life, a person who simply does their job well is already quite admirable. But in a world where someone holds the largest nuclear arsenal in human history, the failure to ask questions could lead to extremely dangerous consequences. In 1957, when LeMay left SAC to become Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, a man named Thomas S. Power stepped into the position that many in the U.S. military considered the most powerful of all. Not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, not the Secretary of Defense, but the commander of Strategic Air Command. Because this was not simply a military headquarters, it was like a doomsday machine, always ready to operate, never resting, day or night throughout the year. Under Power's command, everything ran with extreme tension and rigor. At any moment, day or night, 1/3 of all B-52 bombers stood ready to take off within 15 minutes. Beyond that, many others were already airborne, carrying nuclear bombs, circling near Soviet borders. If the order to attack came, they would not need to return to base. They would simply change course and fly straight to their targets. From the moment an order was received to the moment the first bombs fell on Soviet soil, it could take only a matter of hours. Thomas Power did not merely preserve the system LeMay had left behind. He made it faster and more powerful.
He increased the number of aircraft on aerial patrol, reduced response times to the absolute minimum, and trained pilots to the point where they could carry out their missions even when they were exhausted, frightened, or without fully understanding their orders. He wanted to create a machine that required little thought, one that needed only to receive a command and act instantly. On the surface, this might sound like the pinnacle of military professionalism, but the troubling part lay in the fact that this enormous machine was controlled by a man who, over time, became less and less capable of questioning himself or reconsidering his decisions, the longer he sat in that seat of power.
In 1960, there was a man named Daniel Ellsberg. At the time, he was young, working for the Rand Corporation, an organization specializing in research and consulting for the U.S. Department of Defense. His job was fairly routine, reviewing military plans, assessing whether they made sense, and offering his analysis. One day, he was sent to a major U.S. Air Force base to attend a briefing on nuclear war plans. At first, he assumed it would be just another ordinary work trip. But things quickly became anything but ordinary. The man presenting was Thomas S. Power. From the very start of the session, Ellsberg sensed something was wrong, not because the plan was overly complex, but because of the way this general talked about it. When someone in the room asked whether it might be possible to conduct strikes while avoiding harm to civilians, Power showed no anger or irritation. He simply looked at the questioner with an expression that suggested he didn't understand why anyone would even think to raise that, as though someone had asked a completely irrelevant question. To him, the distinction between civilians and military personnel seemed to carry no meaning in nuclear war. After the meeting ended, on the way back, Ellsberg quietly told a colleague beside him that this was the first time in his life he felt he had just encountered someone who was truly not right. His colleague responded, "Do you understand how terrifying that is? That someone like that is in control of an entire nation's nuclear weapons?" Ellsberg went silent, then nodded. He understood perfectly, and that deeply unsettling experience haunted him for years afterward, and was part of what drove him to eventually leak classified U.S. government documents, because he knew all too well people like that were holding decisions in their hands that could affect the entire world. To understand what kind of man Thomas Power was, one must first understand a very particular school of thought that existed during the Cold War, known as the First Strike. Nuclear strategists of that era did not all think alike. Some, like Robert McNamara, believed that if both sides possessed enough weapons to annihilate each other, neither would dare strike first. They called it mutually assured destruction, and it was precisely that fear, they argued, that would keep the world from falling into war. But Power thought completely differently. In his mind, nuclear weapons were not for deterrence, they were for winning. And to win, you had to strike first, fast, before the enemy had time to react. To him, waiting to be attacked before hitting back was a mistake, like voluntarily throwing away your own advantage. In truth, such thinking was not entirely uncommon at the time. Several other generals held comparably hard-line views. Curtis LeMay, for instance, also believed in the power of offensive action. But LeMay still understood that the use of nuclear weapons was an enormously consequential decision, one that had to be made by the government, not acted upon unilaterally by the military. Power, by contrast, gave people no such reassurance. There is one small story that chills anyone who hears it. In 1960, during a large meeting of the Strategic Air Command, Power was presenting a nuclear war plan. A young analyst from the Rand Corporation stood up and asked, might it be worth holding some weapons in reserve rather than expending everything at the outset, so that there would still be room to negotiate an end to the war? Power paused, looked directly at the man, and asked a very short question. Negotiate with whom? He continued by saying there would be no one left alive to negotiate with. The entire room fell completely silent. No one said another word. The meeting continued as though nothing had happened. But the terrifying part was that this was not a joke. His voice was entirely serious. This was not merely a personal opinion. It was the worldview of a man who held control over thousands of nuclear weapons. In 1961, when Robert McNamara became Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy,
he began changing the way America thought about nuclear war. Unlike the generals accustomed to all-or-nothing thinking, McNamara was a pragmatist who calculated everything carefully. He believed that if nuclear war were to occur, the U.S. needed a range of options and the ability to manage the situation, not simply press a button and hurtle straight into apocalypse. He wanted decisions of that magnitude to rest in the hands of civilian government, not the military alone. But there was one man who deeply resented these ideas, Curtis LeMay. As head of the Strategic Air Command, he was accustomed to thinking that if war broke out, you hit hard and fast. There was no such thing as fighting a little or setting limits. And so began a quiet but intensely tense standoff between the two men. LeMay did not openly defy orders as some generals before him had done. He chose a different approach. He stalled, slowed every new initiative, and quietly persuaded officers under his command that McNamara's ideas were dangerous and unrealistic. In meetings, he consistently argued that once nuclear weapons were used, there would be no controlling or containing them. Everything would spiral beyond anyone's grasp. To be fair, LeMay was not entirely wrong. This remains a deeply complex issue that experts still debate today. But the significant point is that he used his position to obstruct the implementation of policies his own government had decided upon. He did not resist formally or openly, but his resistance was quiet and remarkably effective. McNamara knew all of this and was far from pleased, but he could not easily dismiss LeMay either. This was the most tense period of the Cold War, and replacing the commander of the most critical nuclear force risked sending the wrong signal to both the Soviet Union and the American public. LeMay understood that and effectively held his seat with near total security. In the end, he remained in his position until 1964, retiring at the mandatory age. He was not relieved of command, not disciplined, and never really changed his way of thinking. The standoff ended without a clear winner, but it revealed something very important. Even in decisions of world-altering consequence, disagreements sometimes play out in the shadows, in places not everyone can see.
In October 1962, the world entered one of the most tense moments in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When people recall that event, they typically think of John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, of emergency meetings and warships blockading the sea. But there is one detail that few know about, and that leaves many people quietly reflecting when they hear it. During the most critical days of the crisis, an American general named Thomas Power ordered U.S. nuclear forces raised to DEFCON 2, an extraordinarily high alert level, just one step away from actual war. At that threshold, nuclear bombers stood ready to take off within 15 minutes. Missiles were armed, troops were in position. The entire nuclear arsenal was like a held breath, waiting only for the order to act. On its face, this might seem reasonable given how dangerous the situation was, but what stunned people was how Power did it. Rather than transmitting the alert order in encrypted code as was standard procedure, he had the message broadcast in the clear, unencoded, over radio frequencies he knew the Soviet Union was monitoring. He did not do this by accident. He wanted the Soviet side to know unambiguously that America was at its highest state of combat readiness. He believed that if the enemy saw him playing his hand this forcefully, they would be frightened and back down, much like a card player deliberately letting their opponents see they hold a strong hand. But this was not a card game. This was a situation where even a small misreading could trigger nuclear war. When the Soviets intercepted that message, they would not necessarily think America is warning us. They might just as easily think America is about to attack. And if they thought that, they might decide to strike first. And once nuclear war begins, it is nearly impossible to stop. The critical point is that John F. Kennedy never ordered this. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had no prior knowledge. The people meeting all the clock, weighing every word sent to the Soviets, had no idea that an entirely separate message was being transmitted through other means. Later, Nikita Khrushchev referenced that unencrypted transmission in internal documents, confirming that the Soviet side had indeed received it. But what history cannot answer with certainty is, what were the Soviet generals thinking when they heard it? And that question, what might have happened if they had misread it, is precisely what has left many historians feeling a cold chill when they look back. During the years Thomas Power led the Strategic Air Command, he had enormous influence over the development of an extremely consequential plan known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan. This was no ordinary document. It spelled out precisely who would fire, at what targets, and in what sequence if nuclear war broke out. Though Thomas Power did not write it alone, his command was the force responsible for carrying it out, which gave him arguably the loudest voice in shaping its contents. The version he helped define, known as PSYOP 62, in effect from 1961, was among the most terrifying plans human beings have ever produced. It contained no option for limited or restrained strikes. There was no way to target only military installations. Once activated, the plan would trigger a simultaneous all-out assault on the Soviet Union, China, and their allies alike, striking military bases and densely populated cities without distinction. There were no pause points, no phased stages. Everything would happen at once and could not be undone. When Robert McNamara first reviewed the plan in early 1961, he asked a very simple question: how many people would die if this were executed? The answer chilled everyone who heard it. Approximately 600 million people could perish within the first 6 months alone, including civilians in non-combatant European nations who would nonetheless be killed by radiation. Upon hearing this, McNamara left the briefing room and went to the bathroom to be sick. Then he returned, determined to find ways to revise the plan and reduce its consequences. Yet for years afterward, Power worked to obstruct those very changes. The most disturbing part was that the figure of 600 million dead was not coming from an enemy. It was America's own estimate of its own plan. And the man commanding the forces tasked with carrying it out, the man holding the bombers, the missiles, and the nuclear weapons, was Thomas Power, a man who reportedly believed that as long as 2 Americans survived the war, it could still be considered a victory.
There is a story passed down by those who were present, though no one remembers exactly when it took place, only that it was during the period when Thomas S. Power led SAC. In a fairly private conversation, Curtis LeMay spoke about his successor with a candor that surprised an old subordinate. LeMay did not deny that Power was an exceptionally effective executor. He acknowledged that plainly. But then he added, slowly, that Power lacked the single most important quality in someone who holds nuclear weapons: the ability to stop and ask himself whether he might be wrong. What made this notable was that the person saying it was LeMay himself, a general renowned for his own toughness and ruthlessness. He was not speaking out of anger or jealousy, but like a man who was genuinely worried. This story is not meant to suggest that LeMay was a better person, or that every judgment he made was correct. LeMay himself was a deeply controversial figure. But what makes the story worth reflecting on is what it reveals, that even within an environment as unforgiving as SAC, one that prized strength and decisiveness above all, there were still people who understood that some limit had to exist. Between the lines separating courage and recklessness beyond all control, not everyone is the same. And in LeMay's assessment, Power had crossed that line. What unsettled people was not that Power did something entirely different from those around him. It was that he acted much like everyone else, but without the internal break that others still retained. Where others would eventually pause and ask themselves whether they were going too far, Power seemed to have no such stopping point. Or if he did, it lay somewhere no one else could see. And that, more than anything, was what truly frightened people. In 1964, Thomas Power left the military. A year later, he wrote a book titled Design for Survival, in which he argued that America at that time was still too weak in its nuclear strategy and needed to take an even harder line. But the book attracted little attention. In 1970, he died quietly, leaving barely a mark in the press or in the historical record. Yet that very silence gave many people pause. It seemed as though no one ever truly sat down to ask,
How did someone with this worldview manage to hold one of the most consequential positions on Earth for 7 years? Was there something wrong with the system? Was there any way to recognize and prevent cases like this earlier? And if not, what needed to change? Over the years that followed, people gradually worked toward answers. They began reforming nuclear weapons controls, introducing the two-man rule so that no single individual could unilaterally activate a weapon, adding stricter layers of command verification, and strengthening civilian government oversight. These changes did not appear out of nowhere. They came because people like Robert McNamara looked at the old system and recognized something alarming. Everything depended far too heavily on whether the person in charge happened to be rational. If that person was not, almost nothing stood between the world and catastrophe. Daniel Ellsberg was another who thought deeply about this problem. After his encounter with power in 1960, he spent decades studying America's nuclear system. Late in life, he wrote his final book, The Doomsday Machine, in which he recounted what he had seen and heard while working with the military and the Pentagon. He described power not as a villain in some cautionary tale, but as an example of something far more dangerous, a system that could not correct its own errors. In the end, Ellsberg arrived at a conclusion he held for the rest of his life. However much America's nuclear system had improved, it still rested on a fundamental assumption that the people operating it would always act rationally. But the story of Thomas Power showed that this was not always true. And when it comes to nuclear war, where a single mistake can affect the entire world, being wrong even once is already too much. The story of Thomas Power is not what people typically picture when they think of high-stakes moments in history. There is no dramatic scene like Richard Nixon sitting in the Oval Office under crushing pressure, no fierce public confrontation like Douglas MacArthur before Congress, no headline-making scandal like the story of Stanley McChrystal. Power's story is far simpler and frightening in an entirely different way. He simply sat there for 7 years, doing his job every day. Everything he did was correct by the standards that the system around him recognized as correct, as professional. But throughout all of that time, he carried inside his head a vision of the world such that given a little more power, just 15 unmonitored minutes, the consequences could have threatened the entirety of human civilization. That is what made him dangerous, but unlike anyone else. Nixon was dangerous because there were moments when he lost control under pressure. MacArthur was dangerous because he deliberately overstepped his authority. LeMay was dangerous because he believed in extreme plans. Power was different. For the most part, he did nothing wrong at all. He simply lived and worked exactly as the man he was, day after day, unchanged. And sometimes that very consistency is the most frightening thing of all, when it resides in a man with an extreme worldview. Ultimately, the lesson of this story lies not only in Power himself, but in the system that placed him there. In a democratic country, civilian control of the military is not merely a question of moral right and moral wrong. It functions as a final layer of protection, a safeguard against the very worst outcomes. But that layer only works when those at the top understand the situation clearly, monitor it closely, and are willing to intervene when necessary, even when the person they must rein in is a general covered in medals. Power retired in peace. The world did not collapse during the 7 years he held command. And that fact, like so many things from the Cold War, is at once a matter of great fortune and something that makes people shudder when they think about it too carefully.
Number 9. Alexander Haig, U.S. Secretary of State, 1981 to 1982. On the afternoon of March 30th, 1981, at approximately 2:27 p.m., the atmosphere in the White House briefing room was more tense than it had ever been. Just 2 hours earlier, the entire country had been shaken by news of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Reporters packed the room, everyone waiting for a clear explanation. At that moment, a man strode quickly to the podium. He was breathing hard, his hands gripping the edge of the lectern as though steadying himself. When he spoke, his voice carried a slight tremor, but the words that came out of his mouth stopped the entire room cold. I am in control here, at the White House, pending the return of the Vice President.
That man was Alexander Meigs Haig, Jr., the U.S. Secretary of State, who'd held many important positions in government. But his words immediately ignited controversy. They were not just legally wrong, they were factually wrong as well. Yet the significant point is that this was not simply a slip of the tongue. Behind it lay a much longer story. To understand why he said it, one has to look back at the man himself and at a life that seemed from beginning to end to be driven by one very clear and persistent desire: the hunger for power. Alexander Haig was born in 1924 in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, into an ordinary Irish Catholic family near Philadelphia. When Haig was just 10 years old, his father died, leaving his mother alone to raise 4 children. His childhood was anything but easy. Faced with circumstances like those, some people simply accept their fate and get through life quietly. Haig was not one of them. He chose to stand up and change his own life. In 1944, he enrolled at the West Point Military Academy, seeing the military as his path out of hardship. Even from a young age, those around him recognized that Haig was not the kind of person who simply wanted to do his job well. He always wanted to rise above everyone else. But he did not show this in a loud or arrogant way. Haig was exceptionally shrewd. He knew who to align himself with, where to position himself, and, most importantly, how to make people with power notice him at precisely the right moment. This was not the kind of intelligence found in books, but an intuitive understanding of how power operates and how to become a part of it. Later, Haig served in the Korean War and was commended for bravery. He was also present in Vietnam in the early years of that conflict, so no one could accuse him of being merely a desk officer. But the path that carried him furthest was not found on the battlefield, it was found in Washington. In 1969, when Henry Kissinger became National Security Advisor under President Nixon, he needed a skilled military assistant, and Haig seized that opportunity. At first, Haig was simply Kissinger's aide, but gradually he became his closest confidant, something like a right hand. When President Nixon was engulfed in crisis over the Watergate scandal and the White House fell into turmoil, Haig was elevated to White House Chief of Staff. During the final 2 years of Nixon's presidency, he effectively ran everything that mattered. Haig controlled the flow of information in and out of the Oval Office, managed meetings, and was present at the most critical moments in the White House, the moments when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. Few people have ever witnessed power functioning and then gradually disintegrating right before their eyes the way Alexander Haig did during 1973 and 1974. He sat in very close proximity to Richard Nixon at the precise moment when Watergate threw the White House into chaos. Everything resembled a massive storm sweeping through. Lawyers coming and going constantly, the FBI launching investigations, Congress applying relentless pressure day after day. Through it all, Haig was the one standing in the middle holding everything together. Many people who were there recounted that in the final months, when Nixon was no longer able to focus enough to govern, it was Haig who was truly running the business of government. That experience left a profound mark on him. Haig came to understand something important. In moments of chaos, the person who controls information and manages its flow is the one who holds real power, not simply the person sitting in the highest chair. He had done exactly that for 2 years and had grown deeply skilled at it. But at the same time, he had gradually grown accustomed to a different kind of role: the decision maker, the crisis manager, the person everyone turned to when things were about to fall apart. That feeling of being indispensable, once it takes root in a person, is very difficult to let go of. After Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford took over, Haig was sent to Europe to serve as Supreme Commander of NATO, a highly prestigious position but one far removed from the White House. He served there until 1979, then retired and spent some time considering his next move. In Haig's mind, the destination was nowhere other than the White House, but this time he did not want to stand behind anyone. He wanted to be the one sitting in the most powerful chair. He attempted a presidential run in 1988, but the campaign came and went quickly, ending in silence. A few years earlier, however, in 1981, when Ronald Reagan was elected and began assembling his new administration, Haig was selected as Secretary of State, one of the highest offices in the American government. But for Haig, what mattered was not the number on the succession list. It was the familiar feeling. Once again, he was standing close to the center of power and ready to step forward when the moment came. March 30th, 1981 began like any other ordinary day in Washington. Reagan had been president for just over 2 months, and things in the new administration were gradually settling into place. At around 2:27 in the afternoon, he had just stepped out of the Washington Hilton Hotel after addressing a group of workers when a man named John Hinckley Jr. suddenly opened fire. A bullet struck Reagan, passing through his left armpit and into his chest, stopping just centimeters from his heart. Everything happened in an instant. Press Secretary James Brady was shot in the head and would be left partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. A police officer and a Secret Service agent were also wounded. Reagan was rushed into a car and driven straight to George Washington University Hospital, having lost a significant amount of blood. Within minutes, word that the president had been shot spread across the city. Everyone was in a state of alarm, uncertain if he would survive. Vice President Bush was aboard an aircraft and had not yet been able to return. Inside the White House, people began to panic because it was unclear who was actually in charge. In the middle of this chaos, Haig was sitting in the monitoring room alongside other officials. He listened to the calls, watched the news screens, and sensed something deeply familiar. No one seemed clearly being led. Someone asked whether military alert levels should be raised. Others didn't know who had the authority to decide. The atmosphere was becoming frantic. And then Haig acted on instinct. He decided to step forward and fill that vacuum. He quickly left the room and walked up to the press briefing room on the floor above. By the time he stood at the microphone, he was still breathing hard from moving so fast. Before a room full of reporters and television cameras broadcasting live to millions of anxious Americans, he declared that he was in control of the situation. But that very statement provoked a fierce reaction, because under American law, things were not that simple. The Constitution is explicit. If the president is unable to perform his duties, power passes first to the vice president. Only if both are incapacitated does it go to the Speaker of the House, then the president pro temp of the Senate, and only then to members of the cabinet. At that moment, Vice President Bush was perfectly capable on his aircraft and could have assumed authority if needed. The Speaker of the House and the presiding officer were both in Washington. President Reagan had not been formally declared incapacitated through any established procedure. In other words, there was no basis for power to pass to Haig, a man who stood well down the line of succession. Beyond that, the phrase "in control" carried no clear legal meaning. Authority does not automatically transfer to the Secretary of State simply because the president is in surgery. And Haig, with many years in government, certainly knew this, which is precisely why his statement added controversy to an already volatile situation.
To be fair to Haig, one needs to imagine the atmosphere in the White House Situation Room at that moment. Things were genuinely chaotic, not merely in his imagination. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, no one knew how serious Reagan's condition truly was. Doctors at George Washington University Hospital were fighting to save him, and the information reaching the White House was sporadic and inconsistent, each update different from the last. At some points, there was real fear that the president might not survive. Meanwhile, the room was filled with urgent and unanswered questions. Was it necessary to raise military alert levels? Was this part of a larger conspiracy, or the act of a single person acting alone? Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger said it was not yet necessary, and Haig agreed. But these very exchanges illustrated the reality. People were making decisions with incomplete information, with no clear understanding of who bore ultimate responsibility for answering all of these questions. Haig later explained that he went to the press briefing because he believed someone needed to reassure the public. He wanted people to know that the government was still functioning normally, that nothing had spun out of control. Looked at in that light, his intention was not entirely wrong. People were deeply alarmed. The press was reporting moment by moment, and not every report was accurate. There was a clear need for someone to stand up and say something definitive. But the problem was that the person who stepped forward was not the one with the authority to say it. And Haig's statement, rather than reassuring people, left them more unsettled than before. When the public heard a Secretary of State declaring that he was in control, they immediately began to ask, where is Vice President George H.W. Bush? Why isn't he the one speaking? Compounding matters was the way Haig appeared at the microphone. He was breathing heavily, gripping the lectern, his voice unsteady. He did not look like a man who had a firm command of the situation. He looked like someone who was frightened and trying to calm himself down before he could hope to calm anyone else. The reaction in Washington was not the kind of anger that flares up immediately. It was something more unsettling. Silence. In the briefing room, in the Situation Room, and across government offices, people simply looked at one another. No one said anything aloud, but their expressions said everything. When Richard Allen sat in the Situation Room and watched Alexander Haig's statement on screen, he immediately turned to look at Caspar Weinberger. Neither man said a word, but the look between them was unmistakable. What had just been said was wrong, and everyone in the room knew it. Weinberger, who had been sitting beside Haig just before he walked up to speak, later said plainly that he had not agreed with the statement at all. He also said he did not understand why Haig had said it. According to him, no one had asked Haig to go up and address the press. It was Haig's own decision, made in a moment when he sensed a vacuum and, by long habit, stepped in to fill it. That very day, constitutional scholars spoke out in the press to explain that Haig had gotten it wrong. Politicians from both parties voiced criticism. Even those who shared Reagan's and Haig's party chose silence, the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when people cannot defend something that is plainly incorrect. Haig subsequently tried to clarify his words. He said he had not meant to suggest he was replacing the president or vice president, but simply that he was coordinating the day-to-day work of the White House until George H.W. Bush returned. He argued that the word control was meant in an operational sense, not a constitutional one. That might sound reasonable taken purely on the basis of his intentions, but given what people had already heard, the explanation carried almost no weight. Because words do not only express thoughts, they create impressions in the minds of others. When the person standing fourth in the line of presidential succession steps before the public and says, "I am in control here constitutionally," listeners will hear that as a claim of power, not a simple administrative clarification. Many people later argued it was simply a mistake made under pressure, that Haig was stressed, spoke too quickly, and misspoke. That sounds forgiving enough. But that explanation overlooks something important. Haig was not an inexperienced man. He had spent years inside government, and he understood better than almost anyone how the White House worked. He could not have been confused about something so fundamental. The more telling possibility is that in that moment, he may have genuinely believed what he was saying. Those who have studied Haig carefully tend to arrive at the same conclusion. They do not think he was deliberately lying or attempting a power grab, but he had grown so accustomed to standing behind the scenes and running things, particularly during turbulent periods like Watergate, that in moments when the person at the top could not function normally, he was the one making the practical decisions. Over time, the line between coordinator and person in control had blurred in his own mind. This does not absolve him of responsibility, but it helps explain why he said what he said, and that matters more than the statement itself. If it was merely a slip of the tongue, it's a small thing. But if it reflected the genuine thinking of a man occupying one of the highest offices in the government, it's something worth taking seriously. There is one small detail that Weinberger remembered very clearly. Before Haig went up to speak, while they were still sitting in the Situation Room, Haig had repeatedly asked about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, the provision governing the transfer of power when a president is no longer able to perform his duties. He asked about it multiple times, in different ways. Weinberger told him there was no basis for invoking it since Reagan was only in surgery and had not lost the capacity to govern permanently. Haig did not argue further, but sat quietly and continued watching. No one can know with certainty what Haig was thinking at that moment. Was he genuinely calculating the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment, or simply trying to understand the correct procedure so he could act appropriately? History cannot say for certain, but for those who were present that day, it was something they never forgot. After March 30, 1981, Alexander Haig continued as Secretary of State for approximately 16 more months, but that period was far from peaceful. He frequently clashed with people inside the White House, particularly Michael Deaver and James Baker, two men who were extremely close to Ronald Reagan and whose voices carried considerable weight. Haig increasingly felt he was being sidelined, excluded from the important decisions he had once been part of. He believed the White House was not respecting his authority, and he made no effort to hide his frustration, to the point where Reagan himself was aware of it. But Reagan was a man who disliked direct confrontation. He did not argue with or publicly criticize Haig. Instead, he chose silence and gradually pushed Haig to the margins. Important meetings no longer included him. Information was routed through other channels that bypassed him entirely. In this way, an invisible wall was quietly built around the Secretary of State. Haig recognized the signs. In June 1982, he submitted his resignation. On paper, the reason was policy differences, but everyone in Washington at the time knew the story was more complicated than that. Reagan accepted the resignation and appointed George Shultz as his replacement. He never said a critical word about Haig in public. That was Reagan's way of handling uncomfortable situations. No argument, no lengthy explanation, just letting things pass quietly and with courtesy. Haig later attempted a presidential run in 1988, but his campaign collapsed very early. He never reached the highest position he had spent his entire life pursuing. When he died in 2010 at age 85, people remembered him as someone with deep experience and a sophisticated understanding of world affairs, but they always returned to one particular moment on March 30, 1981. In truth, compared to many other figures in American history, Haig caused no serious lasting harm. No war broke out because of his words. No weapons were used. Everything proceeded normally when George H.W. Bush returned to Washington and assumed authority exactly as the law prescribed. But Haig's story remains worth remembering because it raises a simple and important question. What happens when a person in the middle of chaos becomes convinced they are the most suitable one to hold power, even when they do not actually possess it? The answer, in that instance, is things turned out fine, through a combination of luck and a system that still held. When Haig declared he was in control, no emergency requiring an immediate decision had actually materialized. Ronald Reagan was in the operating room, but he was not in the middle of a nuclear crisis. No adversary was attacking, no ally was calling to ask what to do. The vacuum of power that existed at that moment was fortunately not one that needed to be filled right away. But history is not always so accommodating. There are moments when crises arrive with no warning and wait for no one. And while America has clear rules about who holds power and when, everything still depends on the people involved, whether they truly understand the limits of their authority, and more importantly, whether they can hold themselves together in moments of disorder. Haig understood the law and understood the system, but his instincts, shaped over many years in positions of power, led him to act differently. He was accustomed to stepping forward and making decisions when it was needed, and in that moment he believed that was exactly what he should do. That is what makes his story worth remembering, not because of a single sentence spoken into a microphone, but because of what it reveals. Danger does not always come from people who are malicious or uninformed. Sometimes it comes from people who are highly capable, deeply confident, and who sincerely believe they are doing the right thing. And Alexander Haig was fortunate that his greatest mistake went no further than a few words, rather than a decision that might have changed the course of history.
Number 10. J. Edgar Hoover, Director of the FBI, 1924 to 1972. There is a question that many people have asked about J. Edgar Hoover. Why, over such an extraordinarily long period, did no one fire him? He served continuously for 48 years, under 8 presidents, from Calvin Coolidge to Richard Nixon. Throughout all those years, he did not simply do his job. He wiretapped senators' phones, held onto deeply personal secrets about presidents, and had civil rights activists placed under surveillance. Gradually, he built an enormous store of information that almost no one in government could examine or challenge. Many people assumed he was simply too capable to replace, but the truth is more complicated. He was talented, certainly, but what mattered more was that he knew too much. The people with the authority to fire him understood clearly that doing so could bring serious trouble down on themselves, and so they chose to let him stay. This story is not simply about a malicious person operating in the shadows. It is about what happens when someone with genuine ability is given power for too long without any constraint. Gradually, he began to believe that he and his organization were one and the same. And once that happened, anyone who challenged the organization was seen as challenging the country itself. When power goes unchecked, even if it begins with good intentions, it will always find ways to preserve itself. Hoover was born in 1995 in Washington, D.C., and what is remarkable is that he almost never left. He was born there, grew up there, worked there, and died there. While many others accumulated experiences on battlefields or in various parts of the country, Hoover's entire life was bound to a single city, the one place where power, politics, and information converged. That environment shaped his thinking in profound ways. His family was not wealthy but lived comfortably. His father worked for the government. His mother was a strict and deeply religious woman. From childhood, Hoover was immersed in discipline and order. To him, order was the most important thing, something close to sacred. But order is not the same as justice, and that distinction would come to define much of what he did later in life. He studied law at George Washington University, attending classes during the day and working at the Library of Congress at night. After graduating, he did not take the faster path to wealth through private practice. Instead, he joined the Department of Justice at a modest salary, not because he had no desire for prosperity, but because he understood something early on. In Washington, the most powerful currency is not money, it is information. Hoover was not the kind of person who acted through force, the way generals do on a battlefield. His strength lay in memory and in the accumulation of information. He read voraciously, retained everything, and, most importantly, knew how to deploy what he knew at precisely the right moment. From his very early years in government, he built a detailed criminal record system entirely on his own initiative, without anyone asking him to, because he grasped a simple truth: whoever holds the information holds control. In 1919, Hoover was put in charge of the General Intelligence Division of the Justice Department, with the primary task of monitoring the radical and communist movements gaining momentum in the wake of the Russian Revolution. This was the era of the first Red Scare, a moment when the American government and public were gripped by fear of communism, and anyone with progressive ideas could be branded a threat to national security. Gradually, he began to believe that he and his organization were one and the same, and once that happened, anyone who challenged the organization was seen as challenging the country itself. When power goes unchecked, even if it begins with good intentions, it will always find ways to preserve itself. In 1919, Hoover was put in charge of the General Intelligence Division of the Justice Department, with the primary task of monitoring the radical and communist movements gaining momentum in the wake of the Russian Revolution. This was the era of the first Red Scare, a moment when the American government and public were gripped by fear of communism, and anyone with progressive ideas could be branded a threat to national security. Hoover organized what became known as the Palmer Raids of 1919 and 1920, a series of mass arrests sweeping up thousands of immigrants and left-wing political activists across the country, often without valid warrants, without clear legal basis, and under appalling conditions of detention. Many were deported, many lost their jobs and their homes. The legal foundation for most of these arrests was extraordinarily thin, but in the political atmosphere of the time, no one was willing to speak out publicly against it. When the political tide turned and public pressure mounted, Attorney General Palmer faced heavy criticism, but Hoover, the man who had actually organized and executed the raids, largely escaped that scrutiny. He has learned how to position superiors as his cover while he did the dirty work himself. That lesson became part of his bones, and he applied it for the remaining 50 years of his career. In 1924, at the age of 29, Hoover was appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI. The man who appointed him was Attorney General Harland Fiske Stone, who wanted to reform an agency ridden with corruption and inefficiency. Stone chose Hoover because he was young, sharp, and appeared untouched by the political games of his predecessors. Stone made the conditions explicit. The agency would investigate only federal violations of law, would not be used for political purposes, and would operate strictly within legal bounds. Hoover nodded and agreed to every condition. Then he spent the next 48 years systematically violating all of them.
To understand Hoover's power, one must understand how he built the FBI, not as an ordinary law enforcement agency, but as a personal organization loyal first to him, second to the law, and to everyone else a distant third.
Every FBI agent was hired and fired at Hoover's personal discretion outside the normal civil service process. He built a culture of absolute compliance, where any disagreement was the quickest path to reassignment at a field office in some small town in the Nevada desert. He required all agents to dress according to his personal standards: dark suits, ties, neatly groomed hair. He reviewed agents' reports not only for investigative content, but for spelling errors and presentation. One agent was reprimanded for submitting a report with margins that were too narrow. Another was transferred for failing to stand when Hoover entered the room. This might sound eccentric, but it served a very specific purpose. By controlling the smallest details of each agent's professional life, Hoover created a force in which personal loyalty to him mattered more than any principle or regulation. FBI agents did not think of themselves as serving the Constitution or the law. They thought of themselves as serving Hoover. And when Hoover asked them to do things that violated the law, many of them did so without question, because that was how they had been trained to operate. In parallel, Hoover cultivated relationships with the press in a way no one else in government had managed. He fed journalists gripping crime stories, carefully curated to make the FBI look good, in exchange for their loyalty in never writing what he did not want written. The image of the G-Man, the brave, impartial, and effective FBI agent, was the product of a public relations machine that Hoover operated with the precision of a professional brand manager. The true source of Hoover's power was not 48 years of experience or a force of loyal agents. It was what he kept in the private drawers of his office at FBI headquarters: secret files known as the official and confidential files, along with personal files that Hoover maintained entirely separate from the FBI's official records system. Those files contained what Hoover and his people had gathered on nearly every significant figure in Washington over 5 decades. Senators, judges, cabinet officials, journalists, businessmen, and presidents. Not information about crimes, but information about what people did when they thought no one was watching. Affairs, sexual orientation, financial troubles, associations with people society would not accept. Private conversations never meant to be spoken aloud. Hoover collected these things not necessarily to use them, or not only to use them. He collected them so that people knew he had them. That is a subtle but crucial distinction. Direct blackmail, demanding money or favors, is a criminal act and leaves a trail. But letting a senator know that Hoover was aware of his secret affair, and allowing that senator to draw his own conclusions about what might happen if he tried to cut the FBI's budget or call for hearings into the agency's activities, that was not blackmail. That was simply information shared at the right moment. Lyndon Johnson, a man who wielded political power more ruthlessly and effectively than most American presidents, summarized the mechanism with a frankness that was almost admirable. When an aide asked why he didn't fire Hoover, a man everyone knew was watching and recording everything about everyone, Johnson replied with a crude Texas saying to the effect that it was better to have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. In other words, it was better to keep Hoover close and maintain at least minimal control over him than to turn him into an outside enemy with that entire archive of secret files. Of everything Hoover did during his 48 years in power, nothing exposed his true nature more clearly than his campaign against Martin Luther King Jr., and nothing more plainly revealed the danger of unchecked power in the hands of someone who believed his own prejudices were objective truth. Hoover hated the civil rights movement, not merely because he feared communist influence, though that was always his official justification. He hated it because it represented something he had always believed was a threat to the social order he understood and had built his career upon. Hoover grew up in Washington during the Jim Crow era, a city of rigid racial segregation, where black and white Americans lived in 2 entirely separate worlds. That was the order he knew, the order he never truly questioned. When Martin Luther King emerged as the face of the movement for racial equality, Hoover did not see a pastor and peaceful activist. He saw a threat, and he dealt with threats the only way he knew: gather information, then use that information to destroy. The FBI began wiretapping King's phone in 1963 with the authorization of Attorney General Robert Kennedy,
who approved the surveillance out of concern about the influence of an advisor with communist ties, not because he wished to undermine King. But Hoover did not stop there. He expanded the surveillance to King's hotel rooms across the country, without court orders, without the approval of any civilian official. He collected recordings of King's private life, including intimate conversations and moments no one should ever have had intercepted. Then he used them in ways that shocked even people who had known Hoover for years when the truth came out later. In 1964, just weeks after King received the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI sent King an anonymous package. Inside was a composite tape assembled from the surveillance recordings, along with an anonymous letter, later confirmed to have been drafted at Hoover's direction, telling King he was an abnormal, dissolute, and immoral fraud, and suggesting that the only way to escape public disgrace was suicide. The letter was not a veiled hint. It was a blunt proposal that King should end his own life within 34 days before accepting the Nobel Prize. That was not the act of a law enforcement agency. That was the act of a personal enemy using state power to attack a citizen for what that person represented, not for any actual crime or genuine security threat.
Martin Luther King was not the only victim. From 1956, the FBI operated a secret program called COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Program, targeting organizations and individuals Hoover deemed threats. That list initially included the American Communist Party, then expanded to encompass the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, Black Power organizations, and even the Ku Klux Klan. Not because Hoover had suddenly developed any objection to racism, but because the KKK was doing things too violent and too public to avoid embarrassing the government. COINTELPRO did not merely surveil, it actively sabotaged. FBI agents wrote forged letters and the names of members of targeted organizations to sow discord and suspicion internally. They spread rumors about movement leaders, about their sexuality, their finances, their loyalties, to destroy their credibility. They contacted the landlords of activists to pressure them into eviction. They contacted employers so that these people would lose their jobs. They shared information with far-right groups, groups the FBI knew might use that information to commit violence, in ways that allowed the Bureau to deny direct responsibility while being fully capable of predicting the outcome. In some cases, the consequences went beyond job loss or ruined reputations. In 1969, Black Panther leader Fred Hampton was shot and killed by Chicago police in a pre-dawn raid, a raid organized using a detailed floor plan of the apartment provided by the FBI, obtained through an FBI informant planted inside the organization. Hampton was 21 years old and asleep at the time. After shooting him dead, police declared it a firefight, until subsequent investigations revealed that nearly all the bullets had been fired inward, not outward from that apartment. The Church Committee in 1975, the same committee that investigated Lansdale's Operation Mongoose, exposed COINTELPRO to the light. What they found stunned Congress. A systematic program operated over decades using the power of the state to surveil, sabotage, and in some cases cause real harm to American citizens, not because they had broken the law, but because they held political views that Hoover disliked. There is a central paradox in Hoover's life that few people discussed openly for many decades, but that has been increasingly examined since his death. The man who built an entire career on collecting other people's secrets and threatening to expose them was himself likely hiding his greatest secret of all. Hoover never married. Throughout his 48 years as FBI director, the only person he was ever truly close to on a personal level was Clyde Tolson, the FBI's associate director, who lunched with Hoover almost every day, vacationed with Hoover, attended every social function with Hoover, and upon Hoover's death received his estate and the flag from his casket. Tolson was the only person mentioned in Hoover's will. The true nature of that relationship is something history cannot confirm with certainty, and because neither man ever spoke of it, we cannot know for sure. But what we can say with confidence is this: Hoover, who used information about other people's sexual lives as a political weapon, who bugged hotel rooms to collect evidence of what he called depravity, lived his entire public life in a state where he never once had to answer the same question about himself.
That does not automatically make him a hypocrite in any simple sense. Human lives and identities are far more complex than simple labels allow. But it raises a genuinely important question about motivation. When Hoover attacked King, when he built dossiers on other people's degenerate conduct, did some portion of that ferocity come from somewhere deeper than policy and national security? History cannot answer that question with certainty, but history records enough that the question will always linger alongside his name. Each of the 8 presidents who served during Hoover's tenure at some point wanted to fire him, wanted to limit his power, or at the very least wanted someone who could actually keep the FBI in check. And each one failed, in different ways, but for the same fundamental reason.
Roosevelt wanted to control Hoover, but also needed him. During World War II, the FBI was an essential instrument for dealing with espionage and sabotage on the home front. Truman disliked Hoover and wrote plainly in his diary that he feared the FBI was becoming a Gestapo, but he did not fire Hoover, partly for political reasons, partly because he understood that Hoover had enough on enough people to make any such move a seismic event. Eisenhower had little interest in the internal politics of Washington and largely left Hoover alone. Kennedy was a special case. Hoover knew a great deal about Kennedy, about Judith Exner, about other affairs, about things that, if made public, would destroy not just Kennedy, but the entire Kennedy family. Kennedy knew Hoover knew, and Hoover knew Kennedy knew he knew. They existed in a deeply uncomfortable equilibrium. Kennedy despised Hoover but could not remove him. Hoover held Kennedy in contempt, but was careful not to push too far while JFK was alive. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, one of the things Hoover did on that very day was call Robert Kennedy, a brother deep in grief, and relay the news of the assassination in a manner RFK later described as entirely devoid of human feeling, as though Hoover were reporting on a routine criminal investigation. Nixon, who had lived alongside Washington power long enough to understand Hoover, perhaps feared him more than any other president. Nixon wanted to remove Hoover from the outset of his term, but did not dare. He waited, he maneuvered, and ultimately, by a bitter irony, Hoover died before Nixon ever found a safe way to be rid of him. Had Hoover lived a few more years and Watergate unfolded while he was still in office, history might have looked very different, because Hoover could equally have helped Nixon or destroyed him, depending on where his own calculations of self-interest pointed at any given moment. On the morning of May 2, 1972, Hoover's driver arrived at his home as usual and found him lying dead beside his bed. His heart had stopped during the night. He died alone, quietly, at 77, still serving as FBI director after 48 consecutive years in the post. No one had managed to fire him. He simply died. Nixon, upon receiving the news, had a reaction so composed it struck those present as strange. People in the room later recalled that he looked like a man receiving welcome news rather than mourning a loss. Nixon issued the customary statement praising Hoover with all appropriate ceremony. Then he and his advisors immediately began discussing who would get to Hoover's secret files before anyone else could. They arrived too late. Helen Gandy, Hoover's personal secretary, who had worked with him for nearly 50 years, had gone to his home the moment she received word and had begun destroying files. Over the following weeks, she destroyed a volume of documents that investigators later estimated ran to hundreds of thousands of pages. She called them personal files unrelated to government business. Congress subsequently investigated and concluded that it was impossible to know the full extent of what had been destroyed, because by definition, things that vanish leave no trace. The official FBI records that remained, the portion transferred into proper archival custody, are still there and have been gradually declassified in the decades since. They contain enough to confirm much of what has been described here. But what Gandy destroyed in those weeks, that is something that will likely never be fully known. J. Edgar Hoover was not insane in any clinical sense. He did not lose his grip on reality the way Nixon did, was not militarily extreme like LeMay or Thomas Power, did not overstep his authority in the overt manner of MacArthur.
He was dangerous in a far more subtle and patient way, in the way of someone genuinely intelligent, genuinely talented in his field, who simply never had to answer to anyone for what he did. Hoover's story is the perfect illustration of what America's founders understood and built an entire constitution around. Power without accountability, however well-intentioned at the start, will naturally seek to expand and perpetuate itself, not because the person holding it is evil, but because that is the nature of power. Hoover began in 1924 with the genuine intention of reforming a corrupt agency and building a professional, effective FBI. Those intentions were real, and he genuinely built something real. But over time, the line between serving the FBI and protecting the FBI, between protecting the FBI and protecting his own personal power within it, faded until it disappeared entirely. The most frightening thing in Hoover's story is not what he did to King or the secret files or COINTELPRO, though all of those things are frightening in the fullest sense of the word. The most frightening thing is that he survived within America's democratic system for 48 years without anyone, no president, no Congress, no court, no press, ever having enough information, enough power, and enough courage to hold him genuinely and consistently to account. After Hoover's death, Congress passed legislation limiting the FBI director's term to 10 years, a reform drawn directly from the lessons of Hoover's 48 years. But law is only part of the answer. The rest, and the more important part, is what Hoover revealed more clearly than any other figure on this list. A democracy does not only need good laws, it needs people in legislatures, in the press, in the public, who are willing to use those tools even when it is inconvenient, even when the person who needs to be held accountable knows too many dangerous things about too many people. Hoover died before anyone dared to do that to him. And that, in the end, is his true legacy, not the FBI he built, not the criminals he caught, but the question he left behind: what system ensures this never happens again?